Open the second section on Europe. You have seen the title, is Europe over or will Europe be the USE? I would say yesterday, in the world scenarios, a specific topic has been made by several of the participants. And one was, should Europe go toward allowing extra time for the same treaties, or do change the treaties, which means jump up toward some kind of political union to be in the world scenario as Europe as a whole and not anymore as a single state. But we have many issues on it. As we have done yesterday, first, Oxford Economics, in this case, John Walker, will give us the economic forecast about European economies to have some figures to deal with. And then we go through overviews by Giorgio Basevi, Bruni Roccia, Katia Plate, Carlo Andrea Boldino on energy, and so on. So thank you everybody again, and I please John Walker to introduce the Oxford Economics forecast for the European economy.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me, and great pleasure to be here in Rome on such a beautiful day. First, I must apologize. As you probably can gather, I've got a very sore throat. I think I picked it up on an aeroplane somewhere between Paris and Frankfurt earlier on in the week, so hopefully my voice will last for the 10 to 15 minutes that I have to talk today. Just a few words about Oxford Economics. I know my colleague Emilio Rossi yesterday spoke about the world economy. As you can gather from the name, we're based in Oxford, but we have a large office in London and in New York, other parts of Europe, and also around Asia in Singapore and Tokyo. The thing that probably differentiates us from many other forecasters is we have these global models that allow us to look at scenarios, whether that's about where policies are likely to change or where there's uncertainty about prospects either in the US or China or Europe, and to get some idea of the uncertainties that exist for the world economy. I spend my time talking to if you move on to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I do it, sorry. Sorry. The next slide just gives you an idea of the sorts of people I spend my time talking to. Many of them are in the government sector. So we have many central banks and government organizations around the world who are our clients, but in the main, 80% of our clients are in the private sector. So they're interested in our forecast, not just for what it says about the global economy, but what it says about sectors and what it means for them, whether they're in the oil sector, whether they're in retailing, whether they're in steel, or whatever it may turn out to be. Let's quickly move to what our latest forecasts look like. I've put forecasts up here for the rest of the world as well as for the Eurozone, just to see the Eurozone in some sort of context. And as you heard yesterday, we're relatively optimistic about many other parts of the world. You can see we have the US economy growing by 3% or more in 2014, 2015. We think there's a lot of good fundamentals there, and I'll contrast the US with Europe in a few moments. Other noticeable feature is that we're relatively optimistic about Japan. A lot more uncertainty there given It's not clear whether the new policies of the Japanese government will actually work, given the entrenched deflation and low growth that they've had for more than 2 decades. But we think there's a chance that Japan has finally accepted that it needs to change, and that might be a lesson for Europe at some stage or other, that it needs to change its policies, and that collective acceptance of change leads us to be relatively confident that they will see some success, and 2% growth or so for 2014, 2015 certainly represents that. Much of the rest of the world certainly has been doing relatively well anyway. I'm just going to say a few words about China. We don't have China growing at the 9, 10, 11% rates of growth that they had for much of the last decade. This year we see growth of around 7.5%, maybe picking up a little bit over the next couple of years. But that still represents a very good outcome by any sorts of other standards other than China's recent history, and certainly contrasts with what we're going to say a little bit about the Eurozone. But one key thing about China, I think, that's important is that growth there will increasingly, and has already started to shift away from investment that's benefited countries that export commodities, but has also benefited Germany in particular, and move much more to buying consumer goods. The one big problem area in the world, as you can see, is the Eurozone. Last year, the Eurozone as a whole fell by about 0.5%. Our forecast for this year is actually a bigger decline, 0.6%, but let's not get too worried about the decimal points here. A further sharp decline in GDP for the Eurozone as a whole in 2013. A little bit of an improvement in 2014, 2015, close to 1% next year and 1.4% in 2015. But that's certainly substantially lower than virtually any other part of the world. Yes, there might be a modest recovery, but it's relatively feeble. And I think the other thing I have to say is that generally our forecasts have done relatively well over the last couple of years, but the one thing we've been wrong about is the Eurozone. We've been consistently over-optimistic about the Eurozone, and I shouldn't downplay that. And if I was worried about our Eurozone forecast, I'd be still worried that they're a little bit on the optimistic side. Some of my colleagues continue to believe that because things have declined for a long time, they have to recover at some stage. It's not necessarily true, going back to my story about Japan. Recovery is, even modest recovery, is by no means assured. The other key thing that stands out, though, from those forecasts is the huge divergence between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Obviously, I've not covered all of the Eurozone countries in this chart here. I can give you the details if you wish. But as you can see, Germany doesn't do very well this year, but still remains in positive territory. The UK is doing relatively well. It's France, Italy, Spain, and the other southern European countries that do consistently badly. And I mentioned my travels this week. I was in London and Frankfurt. The difference in perception about prospects is noticeably different there to what I saw in both Paris and here in Rome. The degree of pessimism in Paris certainly was remarkably high. The companies themselves feel good, but they're very concerned about the French economy, a very big difference. Although the forecasts are still not very good, it's certainly true that risk has diminished. This is a measure of risk that we use for both the US and the Eurozone. In the US, risk has come down partly because they didn't fall over the infamous fiscal cliff. And clearly in Europe, the fears of a breakup of the Eurozone, which were very high last year, have clearly diminished. And on this measure of risk now, things are back to before the crisis. But because risk has gone down doesn't mean it's going to stay down. And because risk has gone down does not mean Europe's going to grow. I think that's an important thing to stress there. The forecasts I've just given you are just simply for the next 2 or 3 years. We do go further out, and again, I'm happy to look at the numbers. This is a a cartoon taken from The Economist, and it just makes the point about the US sprinting ahead of the Eurozone in general. But as you've seen from my slides, it's not just the US, essentially it's the whole of the world. There are many reasons why the US is expected to do relatively well, but I think the key point is it's the Eurozone is becoming increasingly unimportant indeed to large parts of the world. Last year, everybody was always asking me about the Eurozone, but towards the end of last year, particularly people in the US and Asia said, we're tired of hearing about the Eurozone, talk about something else, John. And now people are talking about Japan. People didn't talk about Japan for 20 years, now people are talking about Japan. And I am worried that in the next few years, that will become an increasing feature of my discussions around the world. People will give up on Europe as a whole, and particularly Southern Europe. What I want to do is make a couple of broad points about the Eurozone, and then some specific points about areas within the Eurozone. And clearly one of the issues is the whole question of austerity and policy. And there I think we have a very specific view. We certainly think that austerity was overdone early in the process of adjustment in the euro area. And you can see this from the slide that shows the degree of tightening that took place. But the key thing I want to bring out is that you're now seeing substantial amounts of austerity in the United States, but the sequencing has been extremely important. The US dealt with its structural problems early and then can deal with austerity. If you deal with austerity first and then deal with your structural issues, you can get yourself into problems, a la again what we saw in Japan. What do I mean by dealing with structural problems? Well, there's a set of charts that I think illustrate this. One of them just looks at financial deleveraging, or deleveraging of the banks. And this shows, for the financial corporations, their levels of debt to GDP. Sorry, my eyesight can't quite see that chart. I'm not sure whether you folks can as well. But the line I want to focus on is the one for the United States. You can see that levels of debt in the banking sector in the US did grow before the crisis. Not as rapidly as they did in other parts of the world, you can see, but they did grow relatively rapidly. And on any normal scale, if I was just looking at the US, that line would look relatively steep. But the big point is, what has the US done since the crisis? It's massively reduced debt in the banking sector. And now the banks are in much better financial health. How did they do that? Well, they actually did stress tests that matter. Again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but if you look at the numbers, you can see the stress test that the US did in 2009, 10 out of the 19 largest banks in the US failed that test. In 2012, 4 out of 19 banks failed it, including Citicorp. What did Europe do with its stress testing? Well, in 2010, 7 out of 91 banks failed the test. In 2011, 8 out of 91 banks failed the test. And as my colleague Andrea Polto points out, the Bank of Cyprus, for instance, and many Spanish banks passed that test when it was absolutely clear that they should never have passed the test. If you don't do the adjustment in the banking system, you suffer from it now. And you can see how we've suffered in Europe. This shows the amount of bank lending to business that's taking place, and it's absolutely feeble in the euro area as a whole. Not doing very well in the UK. We've not done very well in that area as well, despite what some people might tell you. But the United States, you can see how much bank lending has improved and is therefore supporting the recovery. But I could tell a similar story in the housing sector. I can tell a similar story in the corporate sector. Just very quickly, again, look at the figures for the household sector. Big rises in debt in the United States as they went into the crisis. This, of course, was consumers borrowing to buy the houses that went up a lot in value, and then the mortgage-backed securities that the banks bought on the previous slide. But again, consumer debt has fallen very, very dramatically in the United States, such that the consumer can now start to spend. We've not seen anything like the reductions in debt in the Eurozone, and therefore, as a consequence of that, we've got a weak consumer picture across the whole of Europe. And the numbers are really quite stark. This is a graph for the three large regions of the developed world, the US, Japan, and the Eurozone, looking at the growth in consumer spending, and then our forecasts over the next 4 or 5 years. Look at the US, and indeed look at Japan. Consumer spending has done relatively well over the last couple of years. For the Eurozone as a whole, this is not Southern Europe now, for the Eurozone as a whole, consumer spending has been declining sharply for the last couple of years. Yes, it recovered just after the crisis, but consumer spending in total has been incredibly weak. And indeed, I hadn't realized quite how bad it was. The level of consumer spending, not the growth rate, the actual amount that the consumer is spending in the Eurozone area in the current quarter is lower than what it was at the bottom of the recession in 2008-9. It's not just that the consumer hasn't recovered, the level of consumer spending has actually gone down. It is extremely difficult to deal with unemployment and to get growth in any economy if the consumer is doing that. And unless we do something about the levels of debt as well as unemployment, then we're going to continue to face problems in the Eurozone area. Of course, there are other issues in Europe. Yes, there are issues of competitiveness, and again, those issues are for the Eurozone as a whole. You can see how uncompetitive vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis the UK, that the Eurozone as a whole is. And you can also see how big an improvement there's been in Japanese competitiveness in the last 6 months as a result of the decline in the yen. And you can see that the Eurozone is actually going in the wrong direction at the moment, partly because of those changes. So it's not just austerity. It's not just what the ECB's been doing. We haven't dealt with structural problems, and we've got substantial issues of competitiveness. I'm conscious of time, but I mean, let me just move from the Eurozone as a whole, if I can, because I want to try and deal with it not just on an individual country basis, but really in terms of, firstly, what the Eurozone as a whole has done, but then obviously the huge divisions between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. You can see the problems that the Eurozone has got collectively. Now let's look at Northern Europe vis-a-vis Southern Europe and look at the relative performance of the different areas. You always have questions about what's in the Northern Europe, Eurozone area and the Southern Eurozone area. For convenience here, we've put Germany, the Benelux, Austria and Finland in the Northern Europe area. We've missed France out altogether, and we've missed Ireland out of the Southern Europe area. It doesn't change the picture that much. But if I was putting France anywhere, I have to say I would probably put it in the Southern European area compared with anywhere else. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to move the chart on. Excuse me. It's me not being able to read the chart. I'm using my thing. I apologize. So these now is moving to comparisons, not between Europe and the other parts of the world. This is looking at a comparison between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. And as I say, Northern Europe is Germany, Benelux, Austria, Finland, and Southern Europe, for convenience, is Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. France is not in either of these, just for convenience. We've got charts where France is in. If I was going to put France in, I would collectively put it in Southern Europe, but in some places it should be in Southern Europe, in some places it should be in Northern Europe. It's just easy for these comparisons to keep France out, not because it's not important, but just for convenience of putting these charts together. What stands out, of course, and I know you're very familiar with this, but let's just go through the numbers relatively quickly. Productivity growth in Europe as a whole has not been good, but of course, to the extent that there's been reasonable productivity growth, this is just GDP per employed, you can see much of it has been in Northern Europe. The actual improvement in productivity growth in Southern Europe has been very poor compared with Northern Europe. One would hope that would be offset by weaker earnings growth in Southern Europe, but as you can see, it's exactly the opposite way around. Southern Europe has actually seen a bigger increase in earnings over the period essentially since the creation of the euro than you've seen in Northern Europe. And therefore, of course, looked at on a competitiveness scale, it's not just that the euro area is uncompetitive, it's that the Southern European area is even more uncompetitive than Northern Europe. And the differences there, of course, are extremely serious when you're within a monetary union, and the only way to improve that is either to see big improvements in productivity or to see declines in earnings. But it has to be declines in relative earnings, and given wage growth in Germany is close to zero, that would mean negative earnings growth, something extremely difficult to achieve in any circumstances. But again, it's not just the competitiveness issues where you can see that. Look at figures like bank lending to business. I showed you the aggregate figures for the Eurozone area, and they weren't terribly good. But again, the big division is between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. At least in Northern Europe, banks are actually increasing their lending to business. They're declining very sharply in Southern Europe. And of course, the interest rate differentials between Northern Europe and Southern Europe are extremely severe. So even if companies can borrow, they're not able to borrow at anything like reasonable levels of interest rates. Further example of the huge division, again, everyone I'm sure is familiar with this, the huge gap between unemployment in Northern Europe and Southern Europe as reflected in this chart. And if you were to look at youth unemployment, of course, the differentials would be even more severe than that. Big question is any of this sustainable? And if it is sustainable, how? What sort of adjustment is likely to take place? Of course, there's still concern. When I was talking in Frankfurt yesterday, there were still people, and I can understand the worries that there might be a return to fears of a breakup in the euro area as a whole. But it's not just that there's resistance to that in Northern Europe. I think Germany last year clearly rejected the idea of Greece leaving because it realized that the consequences of that for Germany would be relatively poor. Now I think there's more worries about some of the southern European countries choosing to leave because of the levels of unemployment, because of political stress. But even if you look at Greece, there's strong resistance to that. And to be honest, and certainly it would still be my view, that the most likely scenario is that the euro will survive as it is, and certainly I would hope that it survives as it is. But then probably needs to be some changes. I think if we simply continue with current present policies, the risk of further political backlash, as we've already seen in a number of areas of countries, will only continue to rise. But what, therefore, needs to change? And to a certain extent, even now, there's a considerable focus on abandoning austerity. Obviously, some of the intellectual underpinnings of that, given the recent developments with some of the work done by Harvard economists, has changed at least the intellectual climate in that regard, and we've certainly seen some easing of the particular degrees of austerity being imposed in a number of countries. And I, for one, and I think we as an organisation would broadly favour that. But to think that that's the only solution, I think, would be a huge mistake. Sorry, but maybe just go back a second. Or just reflect a second. I think that there will be probably, even in Germany, some acceptance of an easing on austerity, partly because I think the German economy itself is finding life much more difficult now than it's done over the last couple of years. Why is that true? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, China's moving away from investment growth to consumer-led growth. And that is not necessarily a good thing for Germany. Germany is extremely strong in capital goods and therefore is certainly slowing, partly because it's not able to export as much to China. But also Germany competes very, very much with Japan across a range of sectors, and this next slide illustrates some examples of that. The two big capital goods producers and two big engineering producers, car producers in the world are Germany and Japan, and you can see how much they compete across a range of areas. German companies are going to find life much more difficult nowadays, and this chart certainly got a lot of attention in Frankfurt yesterday, illustrating, I think, the problems or the greater problems Germany is going to face. So I think Germany might be more willing to accept some changes in Europe than it was in the past, but that's not necessarily anyway going to be the answer to Europe's problems. What else needs to happen? Well, I've already heard quite a bit of discussion about this over dinner yesterday and this morning. There needs to be much more than simply a discussion of broad questions of structural change and broad questions of monetary and fiscal policy. It seems to me that one needs to look at a whole range of institutional structures and people's attitudes and acceptance of change. Coming back to the optimism in Northern Europe and the pessimism in Southern Europe, a lot of that, in my view, reflects political differences about the acceptance of change, not only in terms of the way the workforce behaves, but in terms of the whole political infrastructure. And I'll come to a little bit of an example of that in a moment. But let's start with the question of institutional change. This is just one illustration of that. It's a couple of charts that Andrea Bolter, my colleague, put together. And this first thing looks at the gap between perceptions of corruption in Northern Europe and Southern Europe back at the start of the creation of the euro. And not surprisingly, as you might expect, the perceptions of corruption in Southern Europe were much higher than the perceptions of corruption in Northern Europe. One would have hoped there might have been some narrowing of the gap, but actually the latest figures suggest there's actually been a widening of that perception. It's not just that there's an issue of difference in institutions between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. The direction of change is going in the wrong direction. And I think it's absolutely critical that at least those things start moving in the right direction if you're going to get some coherence and political acceptance across Europe that things need to start to change across a range of different areas. But there are other clear examples of the huge differences there are between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. This just looks at one particular sector. It looks at the car sector, where I know Germany's particularly strong. But you can see the difficulties that some of the institutional problems, in my view, create in different sectors. There's a lot of numbers on this chart, and I'm more than happy to talk about it a little bit later. But we know Germany's large in motor vehicles, and we know that Germany's done relatively well. The top line shows, in the first column, the share that Germany has in the overall world motor vehicle sector, 13%. You can see it grew by 1.5% or so between 2007 2011. Didn't grow very well last year, and it's likely to decline a little bit this year because of the problems in Europe as much as anything else. But look at the figures for France, look at the figures for Italy. Huge declines for 5 years between 2007 2011, huge declines in 2012 and 2013. That sector is hugely important for all, well, and certainly was for France a few years ago. The problems of Renault, the problems of Peugeot have clearly affected what's been going on across the whole of French society. And that's to do with an acceptance of change in that industry as much as anything else. You can see that for Italy, we're actually relatively optimistic that things might start to change, unlike in France. And I think there's clear signs that within Fiat that is happening. But is it happening across enough of Italy? I think that's a question for you to debate later on. I think there are clearly, in my view, signs that it's not happening across enough of the southern European economy. seem to get my next slides to go forward. Oh, there we go. Great. Signs that maybe there's been some change in an important sector like cars in some parts of southern Europe, but again, I think there's only signs of change there. The point that I would want to bring out, and maybe something that we're certainly raised as an issue for discussion, is yes, there's questions of austerity. Yes, there's questions of institutions like corruption. Yes, there's questions of really poor performance in historically strong sectors like cars across much of North and Southern Europe. But if you look at it, success in the United States, success in the UK is being based on a much wider view of change across a whole range of different sectors. And I just would illustrate maybe three things in Southern Europe, certainly in Italy, that I would perceive as things where much more could be done. Tourism in Rome is booming. One only needs to go outside the door. And tourism in Oxford, where I live, is booming. But in much of Italy, much of southern Italy, really tourism is still nowhere near comparable with, let's say, what Spain has managed to achieve. And tourism is a huge employment area, is a huge area where, in my view, Italy could do much more. To some extent linked to that, we were talking over dinner. Yes, there are cheap airlines into Italy, but nowhere near as many as there are between the UK or Germany and Spain. The tourists in Northern Europe still go to Spain rather than Italy. Italy's beautiful and a really attractive place to go, but people still in Italy don't think of things that way. And everyone thinks of London as being something driven by financial services. Actually, the big growth thing in London and why London is still booming is business services. It's companies like mine. And they may only be small, but they actually create lots and lots of high-paid jobs. And if you look at Oxford economics, you look at capital economics and stuff like that, those are all the jobs that are in London. Why isn't there a Rome economics or a Milan economics? You know, Italy produces many, many good economists, but they're working in London. They should be working here, doing those sorts of things. It's not just about austerity. It's not just about corruption. It's about accepting that there's a whole range of other jobs that can be in Southern Europe and can create the right environment for people to stay within Southern Europe rather than to move elsewhere. I've talked more than long enough. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm more than happy to deal with any questions.
Thank you very much, John. Now we move to Professor Giorgio Basevi.
Okay, thank you. While waiting for my slides to be shown on the screen, I just want to thank you, the organizers, and Mario in particular, for having invited me here. I'm going to present a set of slides which are backed by a paper, but the paper is not here. And indeed, I tried to focus my contribution on the title of this session, European Institutions. And as the title there shows, I discussed two possible institutional reforms linked to what I identify as one of the various causes for the beginning of the euro crisis and one of the various causes for the crisis going so long to be solved. In fact, it's not yet solved. At the beginning of the euro crisis, as we all know, there was the Greek crisis. If you really want to be precise, there was Iceland too, but Iceland is out of the European Union and therefore also of the euro area. So if we take Greece as the place where the crisis started in Europe, the spark that ignited the Greek crisis is one thing that I'm going to discuss briefly, and I will also discuss why the crisis in Greece lasted so long, and then the two institutional reforms I'm going to propose are linked to this. As we all know, probably, is the spark that ignited the Greek crisis was the manipulation of the national statistics, which started already in 2004, was probably due to the Olympic Games and the expenditures that these required, but it was strictly linked to the political cycle in Greece. Governments tried to hide the real situations by really playing with the statistics. And this, when it came to light, of course, blew up the situation. The two questions that I think the Greek case raises is one, the question of centralization or decentralization of national statistical institutes in Europe. In fact, they are decentralized in the sense that there are national statistical institutes, one for Greece, one for Italy, etc. And this follows the general principle which is often adopted in various fields in Europe of subsidiarity, meaning that try to keep things close to where they belong in a sort of democratic way. But I personally believe that this principle has been invoked too many times and wrongly. In any case, we'll see it in this case. And the second question is, therefore, because of the playing with the statistics that happened in the Greek case, whether we don't need a reform of the European system of statistical institutes. Okay. So the current situation is that the national statistical institutes are regulated by a regulation of the Council along the lines of what the European Parliament decided, but they are not regulated by any provision in the treaties of the European Union. So the question of whether they are independent or not applies to the central office, the European Institute, the Eurostat, which is in a way independent, but still not provided for in the treaties, but simply in a regulation. As for the national statistical institutes, there are some of them are dependent and others are independent. What do I mean by dependent? If I take the Italian case, of which I know a bit more, the governance of the Italian Statistical Office is decided by the Council of Ministers. In fact, the appointment comes from the President of the Republic on the indication of the Prime Minister. Moreover, the person in charge of the Statistical Office, the chairman of it, can stay twice in charge, and there is no provision that he cannot go or she cannot go some other place in the public structure for a number of years. So there is at least potentially, first in the way it is appointed, and second in the way the inducement for future career, there is a potential for not being independent. In other countries I know less, but in any case the question of the Greek case being a case of playing with the statistics is not unique. Of course, there are outside the European Union or outside Europe, there are more important cases like Argentina. But even in Europe, the French Institut de Statistique, during the chairmanship of Chirac, President of the Republic, presidency of Chirac, allegedly the ANC delayed publication of statistics because of the elections that were coming up. So even in a country that is considered usually more independent in its institutions than, say, Greece, at least in the past, like France, something wrong went on. But where is the problem? The problem is not so much that some of that they are more or less independent, but the problem requires or resides in the fact that in some countries they are dependent and in others are independent. And because the statistics of the euro area or in the Euro Union in general need to be analyzed at the same time for certain reasons, such as before the Growth and Stability Pact and now the Fiscal Compact, the statistics must be analyzed to see whether the various countries comply to the rules. With the fact that some of them are dependent or rather independent, there is a game whereby those that are more dependent, not to be shown that they have bad accounts, they have an inducement, an incentive to play with the figures. So the implications are that there is an incentive to manipulate the statistics that comes from the international pressure to publish and be analyzed at the same time, and being also a situation where some of the institutes are dependent and others are independent. The next slide, okay. So in other words, this is a suboptimal solution. And in fact, the second best, this is the third best solution, the present one, but the second best would be that all the national statistical institutes be dependent. This would be better. I have published a paper where, with a game theoretic approach, you can show that this is better than having some of the institutes dependent and other independent. Of course, the first best solution is to have all of them independent, and my first institutional reform proposal is to include in the Treaty of the European Union some sort of provision, such as the one applied to the European Central Bank system, where the Central Bank of Europe and the national central banks are all independent in the same way from the political sector. So this is the first institutional reform that I try to propose in my paper. Okay, this doesn't go. Do you know how to push this? Right, in any case, the next slide, just to start discussing the next slide, or rather, this I already discussed, we need to reform the statistical institutes along the lines of the European system of central banks. Yes, thank you. The second question that I had in my first slide, why did the Greek crisis last so long? And also that we know, the negotiations lasted so long and so many meetings were called and went on for years, essentially for two reasons. One was the political cycle in the country in question, that is Greece, but also perhaps mainly because of the political cycles in the other countries that were supposed to approve the various measures to help Greece. In a way, the EU countries are almost continuously in a period of election. And then I will come to my second institutional reform. But if we look to this problem theoretically, or simply making some assumptions that are not necessarily in line with the reality, but consider that we have, as we do have now, although in a few months it will change, 27 countries in Europe and 17 in the euro area. And if you assume that on average in every country there are elections every 4 years, national elections, and these are uncoordinated internationally, then on average there is 1.1 election per quarter. Then if you add local elections, which are also important internationally, just think of the case of Germany, where the Länder elections are very important for international coordination, because the government, the central government, the federal government is sensitive to the outcome of local elections. Then if you simply assume, for simplicity, there are 5 regions or 5 area per country, and again they are uncoordinated internationally, then in the EU there will be 8.4 local elections per quarter, and the EU in Euro area 5.3 elections per quarter. If you add the 2 types of elections, you have 10.1 elections per quarter in the European Union, 6.4 elections per quarter in the Euro area. In addition, you have national referendum for various reasons. So on this basis of simply theoretical computation, you have, during the period 2008-2012, elections distributed in this way. When the bar is twice as high, it means that there are 2 countries where there are national elections. When it is just a smaller size, 1 country. But as you see, they are distributed along the line, not just as in the way that I previously pointed out theoretically, but this is the actual frequency, which goes very well in line with the theoretical computation I made before. In other words, there is no clustering of elections. They are more or less distributed throughout time in a almost rectangular way. If you may go, okay. This is the same graph, but weighting countries by their votes in the council, because of course not all countries are the same, and therefore the importance of elections in various countries are not the same, even though in matters like the ones that were discussed in the Greek crisis, often you need unanimity, so the previous graph corresponds better to reality than this one. So this is a situation, in other words, where you continuously have, or we are continuously under this electoral cycle, and can't go. Scusa. Okay. So my second institutional reform is try to find a solution to this problem. That is the problem that we are always under election somewhere in the European Union or in the Euro area. Well, you could try to revise the weights of votes so that this second graph becomes even more applicable. There are elections in countries that are more important than elections in other countries, but that's already done and difficult to proceed further in that direction. Reduce the field of unanimity. That is also a field where some has been done, something, and it's difficult to proceed further. My proposal is to adopt or go in the direction of the American system. As you know, in America, not only there is an election day which has to fall in between November 2nd and November 8th, but in that election day, which is every 2 years, all elections, national, state, and local, take place. In other words, state of New York cannot vote in May or April or in odd years. Every 2 and 4 years for the President of the United States and for part of the Congress, every 2 years there are elections at all levels, local, state, and federal. Now, why not try to move into that direction also in Europe? Of course, we know we will have elections in Europe for the European Parliament next year, and as you know, there's already been a step forward in this direction, in the sense that in the next European elections we will indicate also, because of the Lisbon Treaty that allows this, the President of the Commission, not just members of the European Parliament, even though formally it will be an indication and the actual decision will come from the Council once the Parliament has taken into account the expression of the voters. But in any case, this is just for the President of the Commission, which is important, but I think that for the contribution to trying to go over the present lack of diminishing feeling of European sentiment, having national elections together with European elections would be a big step forward. If we were to vote at the same time for our national parliaments and the European parliaments, the various parties would have to take a European position, not just a national position. They would have to have a program both at the same time for problems of the country and problems of Europe, which now they say they have, but in fact much of the attention, if not all the attention, is on the country's problem. So this would push for a stronger cohesion among European citizens, and it would solve, or hopefully solve, the problem that I pointed out in the case of Greece, that is the delaying in solving any crisis that would come up because of electoral cycles being continuously somewhere in some country in Europe. The question is how to proceed to this. Is this utopical? How to proceed to it? Well, if you were to adopt a big bang solution, maybe it would be utopical. How can we say, all right, we all stop, we don't vote next time, we wait for the next European election, then we all vote also for the countries. This is something that is difficult to imagine. So we need a transition period. We need a treaty, of course it has to be a treaty, a new treaty, and a transition period. Oh, this is really a slide that was belonging. Did I went back? Okay. So the Big Bang solution is really difficult. So a transition period. And then my proposal is the following. First, a simple transition period, which is also perhaps utopical, and that would consist in postponing the date of country elections in those countries where they are scheduled earlier than the next elections to the European Parliament. Suppose in December in some country an election is due, wait until next year when the European elections will take place. Or if in 2015 some election in some country is due, anticipate that to the date of the next European election, which is, I think, in May 2014. This is also a bit difficult to accept politically because in the first case, that is postponement, the opposition may not like to see the present government stay longer than expected. Or in the second case, anticipation, it is the incumbent government that doesn't like to have to give up power before what is normally due. So a more political, hopefully realistic solution to the transition process would be, now I try to explain, but if you think of it, it's really simple. And that is to postpone or anticipate not completely, but by a fraction of the remaining period to the European elections. If the national elections are due earlier than the next European elections, then it will be postponed by a fraction of the remaining period to European elections, the fraction being equal to the share of the incumbent government majority. So assume that the government has 100% majority, then it is postponed completely to the next European elections because there is no opposition that is against it. But if there is a position, say, of 40%, then it will be postponed only by 60%, so that the opposition interest in not having the government in office longer than expected is somewhat met. And vice versa for elections that are due later. There you anticipate by a fraction equal to the share of the opposition. So you may think that this is utopic, but before thinking that, there is an objection which is realistic. And I try to consider various objections. There may be more, and I will try to consider more. The objection is that governments, for various reasons, may have to call for earlier elections. Then what happens? You cannot avoid the situation of having earlier elections for some reason. Well, then you do have earlier elections, but the provision would be that the time span of the government, the results from the early elections, will be the remaining time to the next European elections, so that it will be only once, and then you start again with a common date for everyone. So this is the proposal, and it will require a change in the treaty. You may think that is maybe an interesting thing, but something that it's very difficult to make it acceptable. Still, I think that if we stick to the present situation, and if we think of the American situation where there is a common date for every type of elections, every 2 years, we cannot think of being the United States of Europe, like somewhere in the program it's indicated. To have the United States of Europe, you have to have elections, of course, but you can't be continuously in election period. If you are continuously in election period, any country can blackmail the others by saying, well, now I can't decide, I have to go back to my electorate, and then we'll decide. And there will be elections every month, more or less, well, you see my computation. So this is my proposal. I hope it will be discussed somewhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgio. I would say the first question about the statistics. I will show this afternoon, with respect to Italy, that we didn't make many tricks on statistics. But the Italian way of making tricks on statistics is not caring about statistics, but talking about economic policy referred to forecasted future figures. But we'll see this afternoon. And the second point is, obviously, we have to adjust this mess of elections all over the months. But on the other side, we have to move power to a European government. So both ways, I mean, that's what we need. Now we move to Fulceri Bruni Roccia. He has been for many years at the European Investment Bank and at the University of Bologna. Please, Fulceri.
Thank you. My presentation is following logically the one of Paolo Guerrieri yesterday evening, which was stimulating European institutions, and the one of John, who has presented the real economy frame of Euro area, Europe and Euro area. In June 2012, the European Council has launched the Compact for Growth and Jobs, comprising a range of policies aiming at stimulating growth and encompassing measures for consolidation of public finance, for structural reforms, notably in the field of labor law, and targeted investments. In my presentation, I will deal with the third subject, targeted investments. Since I'm working in the European Investment Bank, which is the most important tool for targeted investments on real economy. Maybe it's useful to give 2 numbers. The European Union budget, 2013-2019, is up to 900 billion euros. However, this is the budget for 6 years. It means that each year there are more or less 150 billion euros. Out of that, more or less a third is going on agriculture. So, for each year has left more or less 100 billion. Out of the 100 billion, more or less 40% is going for the running of the machine. So for the real economy is left, for the real world is left something like 60 billion. Out of the 60 billion, at least 10 billion are going not on real economy, let's say, but on policies for family, for justice, for foreign affairs, for internal securities, for cybersecurity, for whatever other very important policies. So for a real economy is left more or less 50 billion. So when we read about the 900 billion, in reality we are talking about a number of 60. I mean, it's very often is presented in a tricky way. At the same time, European Investment Bank is investing, all in investment, capital investment, something like 60 to 70 billion per year, and is normally coagulating an amount which is twice as big for each euro we put. So our investment normally coagulates something like 180 billion per year. That is why it's important to talk about EIB, and it's important to talk about the difficulties we find in real economy to deliver the job, which has stimulate growth. The capital increase has been approved for a capital increase of 10 billion euros has been approved in December 2012, after 6 months of negotiation, how to do it, how to share it, and whatever. This capital increase of 10 billion euros of EIB is the most important element of concrete and real economy action of the European Union. And if you remember, was a key cornerstone of the political campaign of Mr. Hollande in France. So it's something that the entire European institutions and governments are looking at, how we are going to use it and how can we stimulate economy. 10 billion euros of capital increase is stimulating something like 60 more billion of investment of EIB in the next 3 years. So we should be able to pass from, let's say, 60 billion euros of disbursement to 80 billion euros of disbursement per year. We are talking about 0.5% of European Union GDP. So we are talking about something serious, and if all this amount of money is an investment, the leveraging effects should be important. It is important to have it as capital increase because what is vital and is not very much discussed on newspapers is that EIB will continue to have the AAA. Because if EIB will lose the AAA, the impact would be disastrous for the entire economy. Why? Because we issue bonds. We don't use money from fiscal money from fiscality. We raise capital on the market. And pension funds, banks are packed with our bonds. The moment that we are losing the AAA, the entire banking system could be shaken because the ratios, the solvency ratios of the bank would be shaken. So it was extremely important to put innate money on the capital, on the capital increase of EIB, and to use it to leverage investments. As I said, there is an effect of leveraging. From 10 billion, we calculate that we can disburse and raise on AAA cost funds for 60 billion more on what we already do for 3 years, so 20 billion more per year. And since we calculate normally 2 euros for each euro we put, we could move 180 million more of what we already do for the next 3 years. Doing that, the member state have assigned a task, a specific task to EIB within the framework of what we normally do, which is investing in energy, infrastructure, innovation, and cohesion among European regions, to concentrate on 3 issues. First, growth and employment. It may seem obvious to you. Well, what is new on that? Well, it's enough to think 5 years ago, nobody was talking about growth. the European Council was telling us to concentrate on renewable energy, on a clean, sustainable energy policy. That was the issue. Or 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, if you remember, the target of EIB would have been to concentrate on trans-European networks. Today, there is less emphasis of that because a large infrastructure may be vital for the long-term development, but the Council of Europe is considering that the priority is giving job to people. So to invest less on highways or roads and to invest more where job can be created. Just to figure out how things goes on, our Board of Governors, our, let's say, Conseil d'Administration, is constituted by the Minister of Finance of Europe. So twice a year, they meet in Luxembourg. In the morning, they have the hat of Minister of Finance. In the afternoon, they come to EIB and they have the hat of EIB governors. So, of course, they translate the political decision in operational decision and targets of EIB in the afternoon. So we have to, our targets now are growth and employment, are geographically given targets, mainly to the countries which receive adjustment programs, are under adjustment programs, which are Cyprus, Hungary, Romania, Latvia, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland. And third, to concentrate on small, medium-sized enterprise, which, according to experience, are the engine for creating jobs. A large, a small, medium-sized enterprise is the first job, is normally the first job of a young person. Small, medium-sized enterprises employ a disproportionately larger number of young people than large companies. So that is the frame for EIB, and therefore the good news that everything is fine. We have the European institution dealing with growth. The European institution has been provided with new money. The European institution is one of the, EIB, I mean, is one of the few institutions in the world having a AAA. And the EIB has a clear target on dimension of investment, sector, and the area where to invest. So, very good news, we can go home. Then our president passed the message down to the services, and we encounter very, very serious problems in delivering the job. The first problem we encounter is demand, is what I discussed briefly yesterday. The demand for real investments is today, according to our analysis, at 80% of what was in 2007, all over Europe. We don't have demand even from small, medium-sized enterprises for real investments. What is very much discussed about credit crunch is, of course, very much true, but even if there was not credit crunch, there would not be enough investments to relaunch economy. For many reasons, we can discuss what is the egg and the chicken, but the situation today is that EIB has the money, has the mission to disburse, are cheap money, and we don't know where to disburse. There is no demand. There is no projects. Small, medium-sized enterprises are waiting. It's rare to find a small entrepreneur willing to invest in his own enterprise because it doesn't know whether his own enterprise will survive and what direction it should take. Whereas there is a very strong demand for running capital, and there is a very serious credit crunch, which is the consequence of several reasons, but what we observe is that since payment were used to be done at 60 days, and today the average is 160 days, of course there is a huge problem of running capital, and banking anticipation, of course, is much more expensive because of the anticipation is discounted on 160 days, whereas before the crisis was discounted at 60 days. The second problem we have after demand is intermediation. EIB cannot reach the target personally. If our target is growth, and if growth and employment is given in small, medium-sized enterprises, we cannot imagine that EIB is finding the small, medium-sized enterprises. We don't have the network, we don't have the people. We are 2,000 persons. We need the banking system. We can discuss and negotiate directly with Ferrovie dello Stato, but we cannot discuss directly with a small enterprise asking for 1 million euros. So we need the banking system. The banking system is not there to play the job. For 3 reasons. The first reason is the excessive leverage of the banking system and the effort to go to deleverage, as John said. The second problem is the capital requirement of banks. So they have different priorities where to put resources. And the third huge problem is the cost opportunity of intermediating banks, because it's common knowledge is much more interesting for banks to invest in a BTP or, rather than to lend to small, medium-sized enterprise, even with EIB money. So EIB monies are borrowed by the banking system and create a debt in the balance sheet. So why they should encounter in this debt in order to have a gain of 15, 20 basis points when they can use the same amount of capital to cover a debt which will go on buying bonds and giving a leverage of a gain of 2%. So the banking system is not there to help EIB to deliver the job. So first problem, the demand. Second problem, intermediation. The third problem is market fragmentation. EIB is a Central European institution, deliver money at the same price all over Europe. We look at the project. Whatever project from Finland to Portugal is assessed the same way, because what is assessed is the project, and money are disbursed at the same interest rate. The problem is that the banking system doesn't think like that. German banks lend to German companies, and Italian banks lend to Italian companies. Do not. No. Do not lend. This is mainly, is mainly due from institutional vision to the lack of a banking union, because we don't have common supervision and we don't have a common bankruptcy procedure in Europe. So until when there will not be a banking union, banks will look at their own market as a primary target. market segmentation is not only that. Market segmentation is also a real segmentation, a dramatic and increasing segmentation between large enterprises and small, medium-sized enterprises. Large enterprises have always borrowed at cheaper interest rate than small, medium-sized enterprises. This is understandable, but the gap is widening. And this is deleterious for job creation. Why? Because capital investment in large enterprises are unfortunately very much focused on destroying jobs, robotization, for instance, or delocalization, whereas small, medium-sized enterprises invest. When they invest, normally they create jobs. So these are the main three problems we encounter for when we want to deliver the jobs we have been assigned with: demand, intermediation, and market segmentation. So what can be done? Well, first of all, we should try not to absorb too much capital on the market. Because if one side we say EIB has to disburse more, well, we get money in the market. But if we get money at a cheap interest rate, banks are very much interested to cover the part of their balance sheet they have to have on AAA to buy our bonds. And so we dry the market. So what we could do and what we are reasoning is to discount our receivables, our credit, to the European Central Bank, to create a new liquidity, which we expect, or at least we suppose, should not be inflationary, because is going entirely to real economy and not to consumption. There are several technical problems to be solved with the European Central Bank, but if we could move from a massive funding on the open market, a funding which is 70 to 80 billion euros per year, to funding for a large part, a third or even 50% with the European Central Bank, we could alleviate the stress of the market. We have to consider that EIB today is probably the fifth operator in the market around the world, being the fourth, the treasuries of nations, the United Nations Treasury, the Japanese Treasury, the Italian Treasury, the German Treasury, and then EIB, issuing something like 70, 80 billion euros per year. That on funding. On funding, what also we can do is to help the development of the mini-bond market, which has been even proposed by Monti in Italy, for instance. But the market is not really moving. And on that, we have a branch which is called European Investment Fund, which is working on this field in order to allow small, medium-sized enterprises to enter directly on the open market. On the lending side, instead, what we have to do? Well, the most important action we can do is to help the leveraging banks. Using the banking system as has been done today is no more possible, as I said before. We use the banking system for two reasons: for marketing, for finding the client, and for banking intermediation. So we lend to a bank, and the bank lends to a small, medium-sized enterprise. So in our books, there is not the risk of a small, medium-sized enterprise, but the risk of an intermediating bank. On the other side, on the book of the bank, there is a debt toward EIB. So there is a debt, and that is the problem. So we could move from a system of banking intermediation to a system of risk-sharing with the European Union. I mean, using the European banking system, in order to find the client as medium, more small-size enterprises, giving, of course, a benefit to the bank to do this job, but having the risk, having in our books not the bank, but the European Union. How? Using part of the 50 billion for the real economy that is in the European Union balance sheet, as I started talking about the 900 billion. Today, a large part of that amount is disbursed as grants to regions and to industries all over Europe. If even a small part of that would be used as a guarantee for European Investment Bank in a risk-sharing facility, considering a default ratio of 3%, using just 10 billion euros out of the 50 billion euros of the European Commission, we could guarantee 50% of the entire balance sheet, EIB balance sheet. And so the 50% of EIB balance sheet could be guaranteed by 10 billion European Commission funds, deleveraging the banks. At that point, banks could charge less to the medium-sized enterprise and could be much more willing to disburse. This implies a huge political change, unfortunately, because you may imagine what are the kind of clusters, the kind of lobbies which are around the European Commission in order to receive grants. So, to absorb a part of that, not as grants, but as a guarantee for lending, is a very important political change. The second thing we can do is to, and we are doing, is to think of larger part of our balance sheet on risky operations, like mezzanine facilities for growth. Since we have important benefits per year, last year we had something like 3 billion euros of benefits, using this always in a leveraging way will not have an impact on our AAA, but could be used to taking the risky part of new of R&D and startups. And the third thing we are thinking of is to help the European Commission on the youth employment package launched in December 2012, again using, proposing instruments not to use grants as Commission normally does for financing vocational training, pan-European students' loans, and microfinance for young people. Again, we are working on with the Commission in order to leveraging our funds. So this is what we are doing. I don't know whether it is convincing. In my opinion, the real convincing instrument is using the European Union funds as a guarantee for European Union, leveraging the banks, because that is what I think is the main problem for innate money in real economy. For the rest are nice, good ideas, but I don't know how much could move in real terms. So this is more or less what I wanted to say on EIB. I don't know if I have another 2 minutes.
One.
One is on the political part of what we live, as we see always new pacts, compacts, and different terminology, and we see a clash between, or clash, a diverging approach from the Commission methodology to the intergovernmental methodology. Intergovernmental methodology is very efficient because it's fast, but it allows the opt-out, because being intergovernmental, automatically it in the system allow member state not to be part of. The traditional European Union method of negotiation was always ending to a unanimity, but is very slow. And the consequences of this are very important because there are different legal systems today which govern the different international agreements governing the European governance. And this can be a serious danger.
Okay. Thank you very much, Fulceri. The first comment I would make is the European Investment Bank is the European Investment Bank or is going to be a European Development Bank? Because you move it, European Investment Bank had the mission to finance, as you mentioned, European networks, European projects. Now, if you moved into specific countries to create jobs and so on, and then all the consequences you mentioned, it's some kind of genetic change. I mean, let's leave it there, okay? Then you have the question of how to deal with the European Central Bank, with the European banking system, and so on and so on. Okay. I would give the floor to Stefano Manzocchi, who has unfortunately to leave after his speech here. So I change a little bit the program, and I please Stefano to make his contribution.
I apologize, but I have to go quickly. And talking about Europe this morning, of course, we will talk about, and we have already started, all sorts of lack of coordination, misworking of markets, problems in the public sector, in the banking sector, and so on and so forth. But, of course, at the end of our concerns is what was shown as at the beginning in John Walker's presentation, that is this divergence, very strong divergence in rates of growth of productivity, and employment. So, in the end, what we are really concerned about is this, and what is really damaging the European construction is this divergence in what are the building bricks of prosperity and welfare. So the point is, very quickly, is that I believe that in a sense we are, of course, very ignorant about the true causes of economic growth, in the sense that if you think about that, growth is, in a sense, modern growth is a relatively recent economic phenomenon, only 200 years, more or less. And economists have been debating for centuries about the reasons and the causes and the effects of international trade, which is a very much older phenomenon, getting back to centuries ago. And only when David Ricardo came into stage, we have started thinking seriously, understanding something about international trade. So what I believe is that we are ignorant about economic growth. We don't know, and then hence productivity, and so on and so forth. Of course, we know something. We know that structural change in agricultural economies brings about a jump in economic growth and productivity, but then we are trying to understand much more about all the links that bring to economic growth. And in this respect, I would like very shortly to point to your attention another strong and deep divergence that we are observing in Europe, at least in the last 20 years. And this divergence has to do with rates in capital accumulation of intangible capital versus tangible capital. That is, we can show and we can observe that this divide across Europe between the countries that are performing rather better, say some northern countries, and the core, Germany and so on, and the countries in the south of Europe, in the periphery, especially in the south, this divide in performance, productivity, growth, employment, as a sort of mirror image in the pattern of capital accumulation, and more specifically in the composition of capital accumulation in the last 20 years, maybe more, meaning that in the north of Europe and in the core, accumulation has been much more pointed towards intangible capital, where you can put everything you can think about regarding the knowledge economy, that is research, investment in research and development, software, managerial capital, organizational capital, education, of course, and so on and so forth, vis-à-vis investment in tangible capital, that is public and private infrastructures and machinery. So this is not to provide another additional solution for the puzzle of European divide in productivity, growth, and employment, but simply to suggest that this composition of capital accumulation has been another very clear divergent phenomenon across Europe. And I believe that in advanced economies, in modern economies, this has something to do with performance, meaning that at this point along the process of economic development and growth, we cannot think that growth is simply imitation, is simply adoption of production practices developed elsewhere, but has a lot to do with the development of the knowledge economy, the accumulation of intangible capital, and so on and so forth. So when we look at the solutions that we are in a way proposing, I'm also thinking of Mario Baldassarri's suggestions in the paper you can find here for this meeting. We sometimes are almost automatically led towards thinking of golden rules or European investment as very much focused towards tangible capital. Why? Because this is easier to measure. So when we think of golden rules, we are usually thinking of having some more room for national policies where you can invest in roads, harbors, infrastructures, and whatever, which is, of course, relevant. I'm not saying that it is not, but probably does not get the point of this transformation of advanced economies where productivity and growth seem to be very much due to the accumulation also of intangibles. So in this respect, I think that there are all the instruments, both at the national and at the European level, to, in a sense, start redefining and rethinking this sort of investment priorities. That is, we have in the national reform plans, we have in the Europe 2020 strategies, all the indications and all the targets that we need to have in order to at least partly refocus investment strategies towards intangible instead of tangible capital. We have in the Europe 2020 strategy a number of targets that all European countries have been, in a way, subscribing, which concerns, education, which concern the development of the digital economy, which have to do with a number of intangible assets where European countries have, in a way, announced that they will focus and they will respect the targets that they have themselves indicated in the national reform plans. And so, in correctly arguing that the golden rules must be, in a way, revived and reintroduced in order to give some room for investment at the national level, we have to find ways of including intangible assets within this sort of strategy and tying our hands with European instruments in a way, which are these targets that we have been in a way announcing, and old sorts of measuring instruments. We know about education, we have all this PISA classification, but we have many other. We can measure intangible capital by now, both in its accumulation and in its contribution to economic growth. So saying that we have to invest in tangible assets because that can be checked and that can be monitored is no more an excuse to dismiss intangible assets. And the same concern, I think, should be put at the European level, and all sorts of likely and envisageable investment plans at the Commission level or through the European Investment Bank, as was mentioned a moment ago, should take care of intangible capital. How? We have all sorts of instruments that can be put into place, and when the focus, as was correctly said, is on small and medium enterprises, tax credit for research and development in small and medium enterprise can be an instrument that can be used much more intensively across Europe, especially in the south, as well as the employment of young researchers, because we know that small and medium enterprises are the ones that can contribute more to the frontier of innovation and capital, intangible capital accumulation, as well as the young generations of researchers, which are much more trained to the frontier of knowledge at an international level, and so in choosing, for instance, instruments such as tax credit for the employment of researchers, we should focus on young researchers, and which can give a better contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I don't question the difference between tangible and intangible. I question the difference between investments and some other kind of government expenditure. This is a very key issue. And as far as I know, my friend and teacher, Bob Solo, did propose the golden rule. A couple of years after, I did propose the platinum rule. And the platinum rule is the one I suggested in my provocative paper, which is not simply take investments out of the budget. If we wish to have a new treaty, a new Maastricht Treaty, let's say Maastricht II, okay, less stupid and more flexible, I propose to introduce, but that is in the debate later on this morning, leverage on government budget, which means that the target should be to have current account surpluses which is public savings. And then you can be allowed to do investments in a proportion with respect to the public savings you produce. So, for instance, I said each 1 percentage point of surpluses in the current account, not primary, in the current account, allow you to make 2, 3, 4% of investments. And even in the households and companies, what they do. If an household is a family has to buy a house, usually in Italy, not in the United States, but in Italy, usually, you have to pay 30%, and then you make a mortgage at 70%. So this simple criteria, why cannot be applied to economic policy and governments as a new treaty? That's the point. Because the question is not to allow several countries to delay the adjustment until the zero deficit and tell them, okay, you have 2 years in addition to reach the zero deficit, without considering what is the structure of the budget, how you move huge amount of resources from one side to the other, raising taxes and making expenditure without considering the difference between investments and other kind of expenditure, current account expenditure especially. Then you introduce the question of how you define investments, I mean, tangible, intangible, or whatever it is, and which kind of tools you can use to introduce an intangible like researcher, tax credit, or whatever it is. Okay, thank you. Now we move to Carlo Andrea Bollino for the final framework, European framework, specifically in terms of energy.
Thank you very much, Mario. Thank you for the invitation. I have 5 brief points to put forth for you. The first one is about energy dependence. We know that nuclear will end sooner or later in our European countries, and somehow this should be replaced. So this is an issue of energy policy for the future. We also know that we have passed the psychological mark of 50% of energy dependence in the European continent. Now, you may not be moved by this idea that 50 is like 40 or 60 is just another number, but I think this has a kind of, let me say something outside the realm of economics, this is something that should be considered in the long term for democratic problems or for geopolitical problems. Because if you are dependent, say, more than 50% on foreign resources for something so important like energy, let me say, it would be as if more than 50% of your children are foreigners. Let me put it in this way, in terms of political terms. In the sense that every barrel of oil is like, is part of your richness for the future, like one child, as Karl Marx was going to say, the children are the richness of the populations of the countries. So, if you follow me in this extravagant reasoning, the fact that Europe has more than 50% of dependence, of energy dependence from foreign sources, is essentially a problem for democratic voting, because we have more than 50% of voters, quote unquote, for our future that are foreigners in origin. I mean, this is a problem of capital, of multinational, of geopolitical strategy, of Seven Sisters, of CIA or whatever, considering the problem of, geopolitical strategies of oil fields. But put it in a context, for brainstorming for the future of Europe, this is no good, that more than 50% of our resources are coming from overseas. And there is no Ricardian argument that can actually be invoked. This is not a problem of specialization of trade whereby you exchange cloth for wine. We are not exchanging energy for technology anymore, as used to be the old European paradigm. We are putting at stake the survival of our democracy, the survival of our culture, the survival of our future. It's not that we can continue to trade a little bit of our innovation and technology for energy, because this is not the way the rest of the world is going to allow us to do. That's my view, okay? Of course, in a world of good-looking, and friendly people, and friendship and brotherhood all over the world, you can continue to believe the fake, the fable, the tale that we export technology in exchange for energy and we live in a world of peace. But that's not what I think, or that's what I put forth on the table. Second point, liberalization done in Europe. Let's admit that we have failed, essentially, overall, the major results of liberalization, both in electricity and gas. Why am I saying so? Well, you can look at from a statistical viewpoint. The price of electricity on average in Europe is higher than the price of electricity in the United States. The price of gas in Europe is higher than the price of gas in the United States. I'm taking the United States as a casual benchmark for another well-organized, democratic, capitalistic, free market society, okay? Why is so? Well, consider that in both events, in both ideas, we are missing the third stage that was the premise for the liberalization. In electricity, we went from national monopolist now to a Cournot oligopoly. Where is the Bertrand competition or the competitive market? Doesn't exist yet. In the gas market, we have done the same thing. We started with the national monopsonist, that is, when, for instance, I'm quoting for you the case of Italy, when Eni was the only buyer of gas for the entire country, was essentially a monopsonist with respect to the rest of the world, and was enjoying, as we teach in our classrooms of economics, was enjoying a lower price than competitive market price, because a monopsonist, that's what he's doing in the market. What have we done? We have weakened Eni, we have weakened our energy system, we have sold pieces one at a time, the network, the distribution, this and that, and now Eni is a Eni meaning not Eni as Eni and A-N-Y in English, Eni as Italian oil and gas company. Eni is now like any other small enterprises in the world, and so is enjoying, good for her, monopolistic prices from the only seller of gas to Europe, which is Russia. So we went from a monopsonist to monopoly, so from a lower price to a higher price. What is the competitive market in gas in Europe? Yet it does not exist. So two failures of the liberalization, electricity and in gas. Third point, renewable energy. Renewable energy policy, the Mirable 2020-20, is simultaneously carrot and stick. It's a carrot for the research and development sector, but you all well know is a stick for the consumer, because consumers now perceive that they pay higher prices for renewables, for incentives, for all the extra costs added to the electric bill, for instance, for paying for renewables, what we economists would call the divergence between private cost and social cost in a cost-benefit analysis in a Pigouvian way. Yet, the benefit of the research and development for the renewables is yet to come. What is the solution, by the way? It's not that difficult. I'm putting forth negative points to achieve positive suggestions for positive solutions. Now, the positive solution is that if we can make a credible renewable energy or whatever energy policy, we can solve the problem of the 50% dependency. If we can make a credible renewable energy development, we can solve the problem of non-competition in the fossil fuel sectors. Why am I saying so? Because fossils are deployable, are depleted resources, and so they're bound to be, say, under the hoteling rule of increasing price and ever-increasing monopolistic control of the owner of the field, of the resource non-renewable. By definition, once renewable energy is in place with competitive technology, that will become a competitive sector. Now, how can we make renewable energy competitive, or that is sustainable more than competitive? In a very easy way for the future. Easy to say, as we economists say, of course, it would be very difficult to deploy it in practice. Renewable energy will become important when not the price will be equal or comparable to the price of fossil fuels. This is a problem of local market, partial equilibrium analysis, but when the quantity that will be made available of renewable energy will be enough to support a decent way of democratic, capitalistic, free market life in our societies. Okay? So, what I'm trying to say is that if we have renewable energy, even at the same price of oil, but only at an available quantity of 20% of the total requirement, this will not be the solution for our society. Could be a temporary partial equilibrium solution for the renewable energy, research and development, and local energy industry, but will not be the solution to replace one source with another one, as we have done from wood to iron in the ancient times, from iron to coal with the Industrial Revolution, from coal to oil in the wonderful 19th century, and what we will hope will be from coal or oil and the next, and gas methane, of course, and the next solar, clean, whatever future technology. Final point, the fourth point. We know from the major research centers and forecasters that in a few years the United States could develop shale oil and shale gas in such a proportion to become, in the pessimistic view, self-sufficient. In the optimistic view, net exporter. So am I asking, we'll imagine that they will become net exporters of energy. Are we going to a revolution of the Atlantic relationship the way we have known them in the last 300 years? So that rather than having King George III, the ruler, and the Americans, the colonies, are we going to have the reverse? That is, will Europe be colonized, quote unquote, by the Americans providing energy to us at their own price and conditions? This is a question. Of course, it's a utopistic question. Of course, it's a question, but it should be again considered. Because we are here in this temple of the past Roman Empire, and because our host, Professor Baldassarri, has made some provocative questions, let me remind you that the same question was posed between Rome and Carthagine some 200 and 200 years ago. When the Romans said Carthago delenda est, they said that because there was the problem of a massive control of a major input for the Roman Empire, which was grain coming from Northern Africa, and the control of the major raw material or natural resource that at that time was crucial for the Roman Empire. Mario, if you allow me the last point, which is out of the Europe, but I was preparing this for Italy in the afternoon.
That's why the Romans said, Quo Vadis, Carthago. That time.
Okay. Let me make a pledge for all the persons of goodwill, one would say, men and women of goodwill. Let's make a pledge that everyone knows that the commission of the 35 wisdom people in Italy in this moment are supposed to reform the constitution. Please remind all of you who are in the major circles of decision making that there is very stupid things hanging around in our constitution since the last 12 years, which is the fact that the energy national strategy has been allotted to the regional local government. Please, this is something that Mr. Letta, Mr. Wisdom number 1, until Mr. Wisdom number 35 that you know, should be aware of. Let's tell them to rechange our constitution and make like money, taxation, environment, and other major fields of public intervention to be allowed to be legislated only by the central government and not be left in this very uncoordinated fashion as we have done in the last 10 years in Italy, in the hands of local administrations who don't even know what a national strategy of energy should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Even if I would add that we have to transfer that kind of items to a European national government and European central government, because they are issues that they're not anymore under the simple hands of national governments. Okay, thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. Now we go to Katia Plate from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. She works in Rome, so she knows very well Germany and Italy. Thank you, Katia.
Thank you. So Europe faces a crisis. That's what we heard yesterday and today, and it's true. As a head of a political foundation close to the German Christian Democrats, my assessment of the European institutions' role in overcoming this crisis will be more a political and less an academic one, if you permit me so. True, the Eurozone's financial stability is shaken, among other reasons because several Euro member states which were confronted with a high national debt and or high annual deficits were getting in trouble refinancing these debts and deficits on the financial markets. True, Europe lacks growth, employment and competitiveness. True, the EU citizens' level of trust into the European integration and institutions got damaged during the process of handling the Euro crisis. It is those topics dominating the public debate in Europe at the moment, and it is those topics posing a big challenge to the European government. You have highlighted and analyzed these shortcomings here much better than I could and abundantly. But there are three thoughts, nevertheless, that are important to me. Firstly, in my opinion, Europe cannot be reduced to the Eurozone's current problems. Europe is much more than just a European economic and monetary union. Above all, it's a community of values. Those values have provided Europeans for 60 years with peace, freedom and prosperity. The European Union was honored with the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2012, an important symbol of appreciation. The European Union can be proud to call itself the world's biggest peace project. The European Union remains one of the world's biggest economic spaces, and many other European achievements like democratic political structures, free media and environmental standards serve as inspiration for other parts of the world. I know that these arguments are always repeated by the pro-European side. Nevertheless, they are true and even much so. Secondly, the European Union is a community of fate. In German, we call it a Schicksalsgemeinschaft. In the global arena, each and every European national state alone can only be a dwarf. One of the most important challenges ahead, thus, in my opinion, is the strengthening of the joint European foreign and security policy as well. Another one is jointly enforcing standards on the global market. Germany does not have much natural resources and is a rapidly aging society. Thus, we are obliged to be a highly education-driven, innovative and export-oriented economy. In order to be able to maintain high social security and ecological standards, we have to globally enforce certain minimum standards, which will only be possible together with the European partners. Germans are very aware of their very small size on the global market and the importance of being part of the European Union for promoting vital economic interests. Either we will move on together or we will not move very much longer at all. So this is a very important German position, which defines as well our position towards the negotiation with the European partners in overcoming the crisis. Thirdly, the current situation provides the EU member states with a unique opportunity of mending the existing flaws in the institutional construction of the European Union. I was very thankful for Professor Basevi's speech on highlighting very concrete ideas on reform, and I will most definitely take them with me to Germany and bring them into the political debate there. So deficit reduction, structural reforms, promotion of growth, a better coordination of economic and fiscal policies, and transparent democratic processes in the European institutions. Those are, in my opinion, the instruments to fight the crisis. If all member states achieve tangible results on these areas, Europe will emerge stronger from the crisis as it has before. But I am convinced, honestly, that we already went quite a good way to achieve these ends. Please let me elaborate in more detail on this point. The European banking and sovereign debt crisis has caused great turbulence and laid bare the shortcomings of the European Union's existing structures, true. With regard to monetary policies, these include an inadequate mechanism for implementing sound national fiscal policies, a lack of coordination in containing macroeconomic imbalances, an absence of robust financial firewalls to protect against the loss of confidence in the financial markets, and a mechanism for the smooth resolution of problem banks. Importantly, at the moment. In response to the crisis, economic experts have identified two possible solutions that are totally at odds with each other. On the one hand, the proposal that the sovereign debt of the euro area states should be partly or totally mutualized and that Europe should have supervisory control over their national budgets. The second solution involves the intention of reverting to the terms of the Maastricht Treaty and the Stability and Growth Pact, while at the same time maintaining strict separation between European monetary policy and national fiscal policy. In parallel, the actions agreed by the European politicians over the course of the crisis have been criticized by many experts as being either inadequate or in breach of regulatory principles. Nevertheless, I am convinced that the crisis-driven pragmatism of politics is in fact an appropriate way of resolving the crisis and placing the European Monetary Union on a new, more stable footing. On the other hand, the proposals on economic policy emanating from the extreme poles in this debate, the integrationists and the minimalists, do not appear to offer practical solutions to the crisis because they either imply illusionary political circumstances or puristically hold firm a failed construct. In actual fact, the political actions that have been agreed upon have addressed the structural shortcomings of the European Monetary Union. The fiscal compact, in combination with the six-pack, has succeeded in placing national fiscal policies on a more solid footing and decoupled the deficit procedure from national influences. And with the European semester, which was just issued a few days ago, the European Plus Pact, the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, and the Growth Pact, the coordination of economic policy and regulation of macroeconomic imbalances have improved, while at the same time strengthening competitiveness and growth was reached. And thirdly, the creation of the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism. In combination with the plan to establish a single European supervisory mechanism has prevented loss of confidence in the financial markets and severed the fatal ties between debt crisis and banking crisis. The agreed actions attempt to elevate important elements of the social market economy to a European level. This is an important point for us Germans. If we take the European Central Bank's measures out of this equation, as they to some extent contradict the German concept of monetary policy, this has been achieved thanks to binding agreements such as the Fiscal Compact and the Six-Pact. These elements underline the fact that a European economic model has to be based on sound national finances and competitive structures. The ESM does not fundamentally contradict the German belief in individual responsibility and liability, but rather it provides an instrument for guaranteeing liquidity in exceptional situations and based on strict conditionality. Countries can only request a bailout if they commit themselves to an adjustment program that aims to resolve the problems. This instrument has made a crucial contribution to the ability of European governance structures to efficiently counter the risks of contagion. Along with the other elements discussed, this creates a sound regulatory framework. This kind of framework, one that specifically includes the financial markets, was one of the fundamental concerns of the founding fathers of the social market economy. Now more than ever, the debate on an effective economic policy for Europe is at the center of the European attention. Let's be honest, Germany has not always been strict about aligning itself with some of the major principles of the social market economy. So there is little credibility in stubbornly clinging to principles at the European level. In terms of economic policy, it must be Germany's aims within the EU 27 to export as many basic principles as possible from the German Ordnungspolitik and anchor them into the institutions of the euro area. This can only be achieved through pragmatic and consensus-oriented economic policies because, of course, other European nations also have their own legitimate interests. The political decisions over the recent years of crisis should be ground for optimism in this respect. They include more of the building blocks of the social market economy than is recognized by many of their critics. A critical factor in overcoming the crisis and returning to stability will be the targeted and speedy implementations of these decisions by European politicians. This is particularly the case when it comes to recapitalizing stricken banks and reducing excessive risk premiums for the problem countries of the euro area. Greece remains a special case as it is unlikely to emerge from the crisis without further debt rescheduling or an ESM-funded buyback program. The role of the European Central Bank is also controversial in the European Monetary Union's crisis management, with the actual or planned purchase of government bonds and the secondary markets being criticized as monetary state financing. But we believe this can be interpreted another way. The exceptional action of the European Central Bank are a temporary substitute for the absence of European policy measures to stabilize the European Monetary Union and calm the financial markets. Conversely, by implementing their decisions, particularly in the form of the European Stability Mechanism, Permanent Rescue Fund, politicians can lead Europeans' monetary policy away from being the lender of last resort and return it to its original mandate of monetary supply and controlling inflation. So, from a German Christian Democratic point of view, working together for a stronger and a more integrated European Union is worth every effort. Luckily, the recent Pew Global Opinion research demonstrated that Germans still sport one of the highest ratings of support for the European integration process in all, as a whole, and transferring further competences to the Europe. Germans as well sport highest ratings of approval among all polled Europeans for providing financial assistance to EU countries in need. I'm really happy because this survey was not done by Germans but Americans, so the data should be reliable. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is working hard on maintaining this level of public support in Germany by providing political education, facts and information on the process of European integration, the Euro crisis and the European vision as such. We are in close contact with the political players from the Christian Democratic side and trying to maintain a momentum towards a further integration process in the European Union. So I'm very thankful for your attention and I'm very happy that I was invited to be here and have this little speech.
Thank you very much, Katia. Now we move from Germany to the south shore of Europe, which is Morocco. As I mentioned yesterday, is on the Atlantic Ocean, few miles from Spain. So I wish to give the floor to Dr. Abajoub, who is an economist, and just by chance is actually the ambassador of Kingdom of Morocco here in Rome. So we are very pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Grazie, onorevole. Thank you very much, and I should thank also Giovanni Cupido, il nostro amico comune. I'm very happy to be part of that, and I'm frustrated not being able to share with you yesterday's exchange of ideas and listen to many friends and brothers, and I see Radwan in the bottom of the room. Well, it's quite interesting to give me the opportunity to put an example of my very small country, because we experienced in 1983 what Europe is facing now. The way we approached our default was very different from the way European system is dealing with it, including different crises, Greece, Spain, etc. In a sense that we opposed violently, strongly the therapy presented by IMF and World Bank at that time. And we put a huge pressure in giving a content to what was called the structural adjustment processes, and give the highest priority not to quantitative ease, not to any other alternative therapy, but restructuring the debt against structural reforms on the same balanced approach. The results are quite interesting in the sense that a non-oil producing country is still maintaining a growth rate of 4 to 5% average since 1983. Our unemployment rate is about 8%, 8 to 9, one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the southern shore of the Mediterranean. And there is a lot to understand and observe from our very modest experience. And what is interesting is that we, in our very long-term strategy, we bid on our relation with Europe, and we put it very clearly as the number one priority. And because of that, we managed to have a special status with Europe, and we are now, in these days, negotiating with this European crisis the most advanced free trade agreement, including more progress in opening the agricultural market, and before all, a big emphasis on services, which means some revolutionary approach to immigration. All this is under discussion. It will be very difficult because we know that the European democratic system, particularly the parliament in Brussels, is not the easiest place where we can trade this kind of reforms. I can tell you why we decided that. For many reasons, after the default, of course, taking stock from the fact that we are connected to Europe up to 85% of our external financial flows. So it makes sense to put that in a very strategic vision for our economic and, let's say, geopolitical approach. It has another dimension, which is the African dimension, and of course, something like a dream, but we are very conscious and aware that it's a dream. It's our regional integration process, which is now impossible in the Maghreb region for the reasons you know. And it happens that, personally, as a negotiator with the EU since 1978 to almost year 2000, that I was involved in a study on long-term scenarios for the European growth and the world growth. This study was ordered by the Commission in 2002 and undertook by IFRI in Paris, France. And recently, OECD publicized a study which is similar to this one, giving some very long-term prospects on growth in 2060. What we did in 2002 was limited to 2050. And this study gave a lot of gloomy pictures on what Europe will be. And I really advise you to go to the OECD site and extract it. It's available. Just to give you some figures, and then on that I will elaborate. EU contribution to world GDP in 2011 was 17%. In that study, it is supposed to be something like 9% in 2060. The study we conducted in 2002 gave almost the same result with a different model. In the OECD model, they used a production Cobb-Douglas model. We used a more regionalized approach and pattern but the results are converging in a very nice way. Since in our study in 2050, we evaluated the European contribution to the world GDP 10%. Well, we're almost there. And what is very interesting is the reasons why Europe is declining, and you know, and I don't agree very much with my good friend from Lewis University on that. We know that the biggest factor is demography. And in that study we conducted to assess the historical prospects of this economic growth, we came to the conclusion, it's a very broad consensus since it's a multinational study, that demography and global efficiency factors are the main engines for growth, no doubt about it. And because of that, Europe will be suffering deeply in its prospects for the future. A country like Italy will never, according to that study, go beyond a growth rate of 1.2%. The global OECD membership will never go beyond 2.5% as a growth rate for the whole period. Meanwhile, the non-OECD members, if I take China and India and others, they'll be enjoying, at least for the first part of this long period, an average 6 to 7% GDP increase, which will be decreasing, this important achievement, to 4-5% at the end of the session by 2050, 2040. That added to the aging population, just to give you one figure, population under 65% will be decreasing dramatically in Europe. Population over 65% will move from 28% as an average to 33% nowadays, to almost 40-45%, particularly for countries like Germany, Spain, Portugal, and Russia. This explains the big challenge that the world economy and the European economy are facing. Because in this fact-finding for the future study, the main explanatory factor for this growth remains the multifactorial efficiency. And it is based, as you know better than me, on how we deal with competition policies, how we deal with these policies within domestic markets. And it appears for Europe that still a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of restrictions are reducing the mobility of some production factors. And because of that, if big reform is undertaken and implemented, Europe will maintain some minimum growth rate compared to other regions. So in saying that, it appears that the future of Europe, beyond the necessary integration, political integration and fiscal integration, relies on its relationship with the world. It has a big connection to be studied, revolutionized, which is the transatlantic cooperation, partnership, and relationship between Europe and its neighborhood. Neighborhood in a very large sense, which means including Africa and Central Asia. It appears in the alternative scenario that a different policy towards this neighborhood will change the paradigm on which we can elaborate the very long-term forecasts. An inclusion of the Mediterranean region in a real strategic partnership can change a lot in this gloomy situation, because it appears, for example, that the saving rate of Europe will never fly. It will be still decreasing in a very significant way, which means that the response to the indebtedness and the response to the traditional financing patterns of the economy will never be sufficient. So having said that, my conclusion after this gloomy picture is that the problem is not limited to reforming the decision-making process in Europe. It's maybe reinventing the governance, global governance, based on the fact that the Westphalian states have finished their historical mission. I think there is no more room for Westphalian states in these new world economy, where real economy is contributing so badly to the global welfare. I'm sorry to say that. And because of that, and having cases like Italy, where we know the government has a very limited range of tools to cope with the imbalances we know very well, since money is treated elsewhere, since the international trade policy is treated by Brussels, etc., and since the social norms or social standards are something like a global domestic open market, where there's no more big room for fantasy when it comes to elaborate alternative welfare patterns or social policy. So based on that, I think we have to understand that the crisis of the representative democracy is also due to that fact. And the crawl of the left, put it like that, is also explained by these huge changes in the capabilities and capacities of governments to undertake policies based on multi-factor criteria and policies. Employment, for example. You know better than me. That's it, as we say in French, une variable résultante. It's not a commendable policy, or where we can really act on very special buttons to achieve a result. So we know that we are here in the very big field of demagogy and populism. 3, leadership is no more efficient, if not existing. Europe has no more leaders. And in a general way, leadership in the world is lacking because the information system and the social networks and reduce the viability of a newly elected leader. And I'm very much in line with what was developed by the distinguished speaker before me on statistics and political representation. And then we have to deal also with the fact that the public opinion in constituencies are no more confident when it comes to deal with politics. And more than that, the European project is not seen as a way out, as the new horizon for dreaming to a different society, more balanced, etc. We see that everywhere. This Euroscepticism is really, really very dynamic and aggressive, if I might say so. So, having said that, obviously we need to invent a new decision-making process, a new democratic system, and because we have to address very important challenges. These challenges are global challenges. Their solution will not be considered within national frameworks. If we take the problem of the regulation of the economy, obviously it's not a European task by its own. It's a world government task, if I may say so. This is an utopia, I'm very aware of that. But obviously, the right answer to the big challenges we have to face, including the toxicity of our commonly shared banking system relies in our capabilities collectively to undertake and be co-responsible for alternative policy to clean the international financial system and be able to develop a bargaining power at least equivalent to the huge bargaining power of the banking system and financial sphere. National governments, sovereign governments are very weak in front of these challenging new powers, non-transparent powers. Aging population requires a holistic approach and a global decision-making process. There is some quantitative ease in the demographic market, if I may say so, in allowing more immigration. It's not a miracle, it's not a solution that can produce miracle results, but it will help significantly in the financial pattern of aging population countries, in particular when it comes to the refinancing, using pension funds, etc., etc. Regarding the climate and the problem of natural resources, water scarcity in our region, energy, etc., obviously we need collective endeavors. Nobody at its national level can tackle this. Urbanization of the southern shore of the Mediterranean. We expect by 2040 something like 80% of the population of this region living on the shore of the Mediterranean. It's a huge challenge. If I just take what the investment should be to accompany this urbanization, and I make reference to the AIB wonderful study done 3 years ago. It's something like $500 billion, if you want, to face the basic needs of this population in urban areas. And if we take the impact of that on the labor market, we know that this will generate more or less 40 million newcomers to the labor market. I don't see how we can face that, whatever the scenarios that we can imagine could be used to. And if we add to that the lost jobs in the northern shore of the Mediterranean, obviously, in this big demographic and intergeneration and let's say human being issues, we have a tremendous challenge that will require a new vision of Europe when it comes to open its mind to the neighborhood. Having said that, what could be the best scenario? I hope will be, and I'm sure I'm not proposing something which is conventional, but something which is not really politically correct. I think we have to reconsider the refinancing of our debt, north and south, shore of the Mediterranean, EU and neighborhood, and seek with the banking system a kind of soft moratorium, and put in front of that a collective endeavor under a new vision of what could be our collective response to the challenges I mentioned. I don't see an alternative for a country like Italy. I don't see an internationalized, small-scale enterprises in Italy facing the huge cultural revolution they need to undertake to be as competitive as other European wonderful 5 stars in the international market. And I guess it means some major progresses in the trade policy of the EU, in particular in giving more opportunities to our countries to enjoy their competitive edge. Only solution to face partly the challenges I mentioned. I mentioned agriculture. If we manage to give a positive conclusion to our ongoing negotiations with EU on trade, we have computed that our growth rate will be increased by 1.2% within the next 40 years if the market of services, agriculture, and some still protected industries, are open. It's much more, 100 times more, what European funding of development system did in the last 50 years, more than what the IB allocated to our region 15 times. Well, what does it mean? It means maybe some kind of a new revolution in the way to deal with the arrogance of all the shores. Our arrogance, your arrogance should be put in a different way, different behavior, and give more credibility to what our brilliant economists used to say. I'm looking at my good friend Redouane, and maybe start again a new game based on equal responsibility to face these new challenges. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Our aim is to show that there is a positive sum game for everybody in the world economy, while we are playing a negative sum game in the world economy sometime. Thank you. We move back in the center of Europe to friends from London, Italians. One, from the business point of view, Fabio Basagni.
Thank you. Now, before I get into my presentation, which you will receive because it's too long, so I will just show you just a few of the 40 slides. But before I do that, two points. Can we hear? Can you hear? 2 points. First, I want to thank Mario really deeply because the mix of perspectives and brains in this conference has been one of the most exciting things in the last few months for me, attending this conference. So I hope this experiment will continue in November. And from my perspective, I want to say, Mario, that my company will be happy to contribute to sustaining this initiative in the future. So very deep thanks, and I'm sure that all the other participants will share this view. Second point is I would like to address Paolo Guerrieri's comments yesterday. I'm sorry that Paolo is not here today to hear it, but I will.
We'll be here for the Italian section.
Yeah. Also, I'll repeat. But Paolo was advocating very strongly a more balanced and symmetric adjustment process in Europe. Mostly between Germany and Italy. Okay. I'd like to impersonate the German side, if Katia allows me. I have to say that after 40 years working internationally, I can really understand the Germans. The Germans are seeing a country, Italy, which in the last 20 years has done almost nothing in terms of renovating its infrastructure, renovating its administrative system, renovating the judicial system. But above all, this country's elite has not tackled the main problem we have. This country's elite has not declared war, because it's a war, on organized crime and corruption. So this is the huge octopus which is eating up resources every day in this country. And aside from just a lot of blah, 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 there is really nothing going on of any significant nature, just tinkering at the margins. We must accept that this is a war. Israel is at war since several decades. We must accept that this is a war in which will be very bloody, but the size of the illegal activities in this country is so large and so pervasive, also corrupting the state, not all of the state, but very deeply inside the administrative system, then unless we do that very seriously, we cannot be taken seriously by the Germans. I'm sure that the Germans, if they see that the government takes even the first small step in this direction, they will probably be more willing to be more symmetric. But unless that happens, I think they cannot take us very seriously. Now, of course, a government in which Silvio Berlusconi is one of the major shareholders will not make this declaration of war. I will not elaborate on that. But clearly, if we go into next elections and we have a centre-left majority of some entity, then perhaps we can have some hope. So I'm not completely pessimistic. Now, in my presentation, I also, having said some naughty things, some very harsh things about Italy, perhaps Ehang Gao will allow me if I say some naughty things about China. Oh, here you are. You missed the Italian bit. So I will just deal very briefly with equity markets, which is our specialty. But since I'm also a member of the ISS in London, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and of Chatham House, clearly I will also take into account some of the work which is going on there. So I'm also looking at the geostrategic landscape around the world. So we have seen what has happened in terms of quantitative easing during the last years. Okay, and the tripling of the U.S. monetary base in 5 years, is it leading to asset inflation? Yes, the markets are awash in liquidity, and this is the Japanese monetary base. The question is, will this liquidity continue to be pumped, or are we near a tipping point? And how long can markets sustain this narrative, which goes like this? There is overcapacity in the world, little inflationary pressure, so extra liquidity will keep flowing, sustain financial markets, give or take a few tactical replacement now and then, like in the last few weeks. And even if there is low growth in some places of the West and in Europe, it's okay. It keeps inflation down and forces and interest rates down, forces companies to restructure, get leaner, get more competitive, and getting better EBITDA margins and better earnings per share. So this is the narrative which we have seen sort of cracking in the last few weeks. The Japanese markets has fallen 17% in just 10 days, which is not really a tactical retracement, but it's something more important. So market participants like myself, for example, starting to look at discount a less liquid environment in 2014, both in the US and Europe, even if growth in the US seems to be picking up. And in fact, interest rates are picking up in the last few weeks, have been picking up, which are, it's a sign of caution. But perhaps we are looking at the tree rather than the forest, looking at the short-term problem. Markets perceive that since global growth is depending on Chindia, which is China plus India, the traditional Western financial architecture is not adequate anymore. So we must involve especially China and also India in global governments. This is a nice idea, but as we have seen on several trade negotiations, these two countries start having a very assertive, I don't want to say aggressive, but increasingly assertive perception of their power and what they want to get out of these negotiations. So it's a very complex and interactive maze, very difficult to disentangle in negotiations with them. I think that markets, at the moment, they don't know how to discount this, and this is why they are on a plateau with a possible retracement. So just a brief look at some of the equity markets, which I'm sorry that you cannot read the price-earnings ratios in this table because it's too much light. However, valuations are full. We are at around 14, 15 times net earnings, which is full, but it's not extravagant like it was several years ago. So it's fair. And prospects, if you could see also 2014, prospects are improving as companies are really eliminating excess labor, unfortunately, but therefore getting more EBITDA margin, more also operating margin. So it's okay. Here there are several tables which you will look at leisure on these price earnings, which are going back to previous high levels, but not overcoming those levels. The European markets have now become very tightly correlated. So the arbitrage opportunities between countries and stock markets are diminishing as these companies really operate all over, with now one notable exception, which is, of course, Italy. Italy has underperformed by 40% the other European markets during the last 3 years. And you know, the reason for that is really, as I said before, the crisis in our political system, economic system, the lack of confidence of consumers on the ability of the country's elite to cope with the changing world. So we have some very good zones of excellence, you know, areas of excellence in industry, but they are very scattered. You know, there are really lumps of excellence here and there, but we don't have a comprehensive governance by the state. The spreads are okay. We are at 292 basis points on the Bund, which is okay. Only 30 basis points lower than Spain, which is not very reassuring considering the fact that Spain practically has no industrial structure worth of this name. Well, we do. So we have. We are going to approach a moment of truth, I think, between the summer and this fall, especially in Italy, but not only in Italy. For this bull run, which has lasted now almost a year, to continue, however, we have to find some new theme, major new drivers across the world. Possible candidates, game changers. Game changers, beside the obvious global growth with no inflation, which we all hope, but this is like being in favor of motherhood. I mean, beside that obvious game changer, it would be very nice if the US and China could agree on a Korean scenario, on a peaceful and constructive North Korean scenario. That could be a game changer because it would mean that these two major countries find a way of sharing responsibilities across the globe. That could be a major game changer for the markets. It would give new impetus. A second one would be an acceleration of the European reform and integration after the German elections. So if Mrs. Merkel gets a very clear majority, that could be something which, tough to organize, but certainly something that the markets could work on for the next year or two, if we could have hope of an acceleration in kind of European institution building. And then, but this is more iffy, handshake and international settlement on Syria, stabilizing the region, preventing that war erupts between the major participants in the region. Okay, so then I will say a few naughty things on China. I transcribed this sentence that a top Chinese official said.
It means the rest of us, not the rest of the United States.
Direct to?
The rest of us, not of the United States.
The rest of us, yes, the rest of us, yes, exactly, the rest of us. This is a sentence that a top Chinese official said to a good friend of Mario and myself in Beijing. No doubt that parenthesis is over. So the last 100 years has just been a blip in our history of world leadership, technological, cultural, political, and so forth. So I think that China, with all its potential, however, also incorporates a lot of problems. 2/3 of China's population, please correct me if I'm wrong, 2/3, 1 billion people, are concentrated in that area which is indicated there, which is only 4 times the size of Italy, which has 20 times less population. So there is an incredible it's a pressure cooker which obliges the country's government really to look for expansion abroad, both in terms of business and in terms of geographical spread and access to resources. Even if Dr. Gao was saying yesterday that they're trying to rebalance geographically and develop the inner side. But this is the situation, a lot of congestion around the coastal areas. And of course, this also implies that the sea lanes that de facto have been constrained by the US Navy and by the other allied navies around China are really inadequate anymore to contain China's increasing naval power and capability. So we can understand that a country as important as China must have much more room for maneuvering their commercial and military fleets. So this is something which may create a lot of tensions during the next year or two. These circles there are all the islands that are being part of some low-level conflict at the moment, hoping that it will not result in high-level conflict. China's strategic projection involves a multitasking strategy, which I will not repeat point by point, but goes from occupying mining assets in North Africa and Latin America with tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of workers, to buying business assets all over the world, especially in Europe. In Italy, we have seen a lot of Chinese investments in very interesting strategic assets, holding government debt not only for financial reason, but also as leverage to obtain concessions on trade and other issues. So this strategic projection and multitasking strategy here, it's like an obliged step for China, because China, I think that Oxford Economics also said it yesterday, by 2030 will stabilize and will probably be an aging, mature country, probably missing the chance of becoming a rich country because of its changing demographics, at least on present trends. So the leadership has 15, 20 years left to leverage at the maximum its present economic potential. So if they continue going in a breakneck rush into the world economy, that of course may create tensions which are not going to be very easy to manage, both externally but also internally, because consumer aspirations in China are increasing, internet access, international travel, capital mobility, so it will not be easy for China to manage all these things together. So we have to understand China's legitimate objectives, but also stand ready for whatever low-level conflict or discontinuity that will emerge in the next few years. Just briefly on oil, okay? Now the narrative, the consensus is that oil is not a problem anymore because shale oil and all new technology in the US will be plenty. But this is fine. This is probably okay, but probably also not in the next 5 years. So I see a potential this year, next year, for oil to resume its seasonal increase, usually in the third quarter, which is from now to September. The oil price increases because there is stock accumulation in the various countries. So I think that oil could go back again. Brent would test again $110. I think we have a chance of seeing again, this is the seasonal stock accumulation. Some activity on the oil front, which of course would increase difficulties for oil-dependent countries such as Italy. So that's another vulnerabilities. That's the graphic, the chart of oil. If you could read it, we could see that OPEC projects 2 million barrels of oil, additional oil demand in the next 6 months, which is quite in volume. So this is also quite a significant projection, which will put some pressure on prices. So OPEC will have to supply at least 30 million barrels a day. Anything less will probably be price sensitive. I'm going to jump commodities. Okay, and then I want to conclude on the dollar renminbi. I think that this gradual appreciation, 10% in 3 years, okay, reflects a political pact between the US and Europe on one side and the Chinese leadership to lead to a more constructive situation. And in my opinion, reflects also a very interesting shift of China from being an exporter to being an investor. Okay, so now they are interested in stability. It's okay for them that their currency gets stronger. They will be able to buy more and more international assets. So I see them very much as becoming an investor rather than simply an exporter. By the way, a Chinese entrepreneur I was talking the other day who bought a fashion business in Italy was closing up the factory, the facility. I asked her, because it's a lady, I asked her whether they were going to produce in China, and they said, no, absolutely not, because our labor costs, and you said it yesterday, I think, have increased 300% in the last 10 years. So we're going to produce in Vietnam, in Sri Lanka, but China is not a production platform, cannot be a sustainable production platform anymore. So that was quite interesting. And on the dollar, I think part of the pact is that the euro and the dollar stabilized at around 1.3 will gradually keep appreciating vis-à-vis devaluating vis-à-vis the Chinese currency. And it's the beginning of a political governance pact. Next race wants, well, I'll skip that because it's very speculative. So again, Mario, thank you very much for this very interesting conference, and I'll see you all in 6 months.
Thank you very much, Fabio. This is the major difference between an economist and political scientist. You can use many hats, as you have seen in the presentation. My guess 5 years ago was that the world economy needed to have a yuan or renminbi appreciation around 40%. So if 10% over the last 3 years is not bad, my comment is it is not enough. Okay, let's go to Paolo De Santis. Back to Europe again. I do believe, I asked Paolo to make a presentation about one major items of the European agenda. Since we are very proud as Europeans to have realized the best, to have some way implemented the best welfare system of the history, so maybe that this is one of the problems for European future. And within this framework, the major issue could be health systems. Paolo is a very good expert on health system. He had studies in very different situations and countries. Maybe Gavri Bargil can comment on the Israel reform of 7-8 years ago. So, Paolo De Santis, please.
So, Thank you very much for inviting me here. I think I was listening to many presentations on the geopolitical and the economics of the world and of the European Union. So I will provide a sectorial perspective on a sector which I feel is critical for the future of our fiscal systems and the sustainability of our finances. I will basically leverage on a work that we as McKinsey did in cooperation with the World Economic Forum and presented at Davos in January 2013, so quite recent. And I'll basically make 2 points in this presentation. I mean, the first point I'll make is that if you look at the health systems in the European Union, we are not on a path of sustainability, even taking into account the interventions over the last few years. So we're not quite there yet. And that the challenge is huge. Then I will move as a second point into investigating under what conditions we could expect to have an integration of health systems within Europe. So what it would take to go into an harmonization of different health systems. And I will argue that, the fundamental social, political, and cultural differences are such that the perspectives of a real integration of health systems, at least in the Eurozone, are quite limited. So these are the 2 main points. I do realize that actually I'm separating you from food, so I'll try to be brief. At the same time, I do encourage you, if you have questions, to please jump in. I mean, pretty much like, a live debate, so please jump in. So we start with basically what has happened over the last 3-4 years across the Eurozone. All countries, in light of the economic and financial crisis, have started addressing the healthcare system from mostly an economic point of view. And they put in place measures, I would say 5 clusters, increasing the burden on the users. So the amount of co-pays on the patients and users has been one in most countries. They've been rationing care, mostly in a gray way, so in a non-clear way. For example, we see in every European country a huge increase in wait times. Of course, everybody has started to reduce the cost of inputs, both on the pharma and medical device, as well as, freezing the salaries or even reducing the salaries in some countries. This has been, good opportunities as fourth to revise the provider network in a number of countries. In Italy, there's been, significant intervention to do so. And finally, in some countries, which are a little bit more transparent than others, there has been a clear revision of the benefit package. The level of services that we guarantee to our citizens. An example is Netherlands, for example, excluding some benefits from what it assures to citizens. So, many measures have been undertaken. So the question is, okay, in light of this, do we think that we are now on a sustainable path, yes or not? Well, if we look at the public health expenditure, so this is only the public fraction, it's not the total, right? And we look at the statistics of the last 3 years for a bunch of European countries, we see that basically only Greece is the one which has decreased, the fraction of public health expenditure over the last 3 years. In Italy, you hear about huge cuts in healthcare. True to some extent, because, the cuts are measured in the political debate vis-à-vis what would have been the budget a few years from now without intervention, which is quite laughable if you think to any private sector business, right? Cuts are cuts in nominal terms. Are not cuts vis-à-vis what would have been if there were no intervention. But for example, even in Italy, the share of public health expenditure over GDP has been growing over the last 3 years, right? So that's basically what has happened over the last few years. And Why is that the case? Well, that is the case because we argue that the fundamental drivers, and I'm sorry for the chart that probably is not visible, but the fundamental drivers of the cost escalation of our health systems have not been addressed almost at all over the last few years, and they're not. So let's quickly look at what are the fundamental drivers of the cost escalation. Well, I mean, here we are in a meeting of economists, so I think I hope to be clear if I look at demand side and supply side. Well, on the demand side, I think there is a growing burden of disease. Growing burden of disease for basically two components. I mean, the aging population, I mean, it was mentioned several times. Most importantly, I mean, more than aging is actually the unhealthy lifestyle, which is showing, a great increase in the incidence and prevalence of a number of chronic diseases, right? So the aging population and the unhealthy lifestyle are inducing an increased burden of disease. The second element on the demand side is higher expectation. I mean, when our income and our wealth grows, I mean, people demand for more healthcare, right? Rather than buying a second car or a second TV set, I mean, you might want to spend more resources and public resources on healthcare, right? And on that, on the higher expectation, you need also to take into account that actually people do have a limited consciousness of the value of healthcare. I mean, they do pay a fraction of the cost directly, of course. And so by that, I mean, they don't fully perceive the cost associated with that, and so they tend to overconsume, overask. I mean, this is, structural. On the supply side, I mean, what is amazing about healthcare vis-a-vis other markets is that the unit costs of healthcare are typically increasing with technological progress. I mean, that's, counterintuitive vis-a-vis most of other industries, right? And why is that the case? I mean, one thing is certainly a good thing. I mean, new therapies become available quite often, right? And if you think about the evolution over the last 50, 60 years, I mean, you name it, right? The number of procedures and technologies which have become available to improve our, our health conditions. But at the same time, I mean, it's interesting that innovation is never really focused on improving outcomes and decreasing costs, right? It's at best, focused on simply improving outcomes, and our reimbursement systems all across the world, don't pay for the value of healthcare typically, right? I mean, you have no technology, no procedures, and typically, as they're made available, they are being paid and reimbursed. I mean, typically, we don't look in a so detailed way to what is the result vis-a-vis the cost of it, right? So technology tends to increase cost. And last, I would say that many times, the incentive systems are not really conducive to reduce costs, right? I mean, if you think about, a number of payment systems rewards activity, rewards volume of activity. They don't really reward, the value of this activity, right? Think about, treating chronic patients. I mean, you typically reward any single diagnosis and treatment rather than paying for a bundle of care for, an hypertense patient or a patient with, heart failure and so forth, right? So, these fundamental drivers of cost escalation have been addressed in a very limited way, right? So what governments can do? And, in principle, they can do four things, of course. I mean, they can ration care. They can, limit the amount of care they provide. They can, make the users pay more. They can certainly allocate more funds from other components of the budget and at the same time, raise taxes possibly. That's very difficult. And then the usual discussion is, well, okay, but we can increase system productivity. And every political and public debate, everybody says we should increase productivity. Some of you, at least those of you who speak Italian, yesterday might have seen, a talk show at night, Porta a Porta, with the Minister of Health of Italy. And she was saying big times with a number of governors from Tuscany, from Campania, yes, I mean, we should reduce the waste. We should reduce the waste. We should increase productivity. Of course, I mean, yes, we should increase productivity. That's ça va sans dire. The question is, to what extent, increasing productivity can bring the system on a sustainability path, right? Is that enough? That's the real question. And, well, I mean, we at McKinsey estimated basically the fiscal gap at 2025 between 3 and 4% of GDP to fund healthcare. This would mean, if we think of the numbers of Italy, of a productivity increase year on year until 2025 of 2.7% per year. Now, this is honestly, if you look at the history of the healthcare systems across Europe, unthinkable. It's simply unthinkable. I mean, it's, there are intrinsic constraints to increase productivity in healthcare. I mean, think about, for example, outsourcing to low-cost settings. I mean, unthinkable, right, in healthcare. Very, very difficult. Think about, firing people. I mean, almost unthinkable, right? I mean, people need to win elections, right? I mean, politics and healthcare are deeply entangled, right? So honestly, assuming that you can increase productivity of more than 2% per year on a sustained basis of 15 years, I mean, it's almost hilarious, right? If you look at the numbers. Well, so what? So what? Well, I mean, in this work that I mentioned to you before, we basically approached a number of leaders and ministries of health and Ministry of Finance in a number of European countries and asked them, well, what do you think about a vision of a new healthcare system given that these are the issues? And actually, we took an horizon which was quite far away. We took an horizon of 2040, simply because, I mean, weighing important vis-a-vis urgent, you know better than I do for politicians. I mean, if you think about the short term, you always think about what is urgent, you never think about what is important, right? And so we took this horizon, which is far away enough to say, look, I mean, if you were to think about a vision, a strategy, concrete actions to basically innovate your healthcare system, to put you on a sustainable path, which actually delivers also good outcomes to your citizens, what would it take? And namely, we did this exercise in Europe, in the Netherlands, in UK, in Germany, and Spain. Beyond that, we also did it in China and Turkey. And it's quite interesting. And I will provide you actually the experience of two countries in Europe, Germany and the Netherlands. Well, what's interesting is that there are certainly common themes that emerge in terms of, how would you think, what would be the fundamental things in a new health system? The first thing is that big data. I mean, you might have heard about big data in a number of industries, right? And the story here is, well, I mean, we are living at a moment where there is a revolution in computing, a revolution in communication, and a revolution in medicine. And the huge amount of data which is available, which is becoming available, simply has not affected at all the way we think of healthcare, the way we deliver services so far, right? Think about genomics and personalized medicine. I mean, we are in a situation where actually over the last, 5-6 years, sequencing the human genome, I mean, the cost of it has decreased to almost $1,000, right? So we are almost able to provide a risk management perspective on how the individual health condition might evolve, what would it take in order to manage it in a risk management fashion. Still, I mean, the amount of information which is actively managed in that way is almost non-existent, right? Now, transparency is in a number of academic studies and in almost all anecdotal evidence, transparency on outcomes is shown to improve health conditions, clinical outcomes, is shown to be good for payers who can reward value, so what really improves outcomes versus the cost, and actually favors providers to improve. Still, I mean, if you are, for example, an Italian citizen and you want to know which is the best performing hospital on a given procedure, you don't know. It's as simple as that, right? Not to think about if you want to go beyond the hospital care setting, right? So that's a huge opportunity to leverage. The second opportunity to leverage is that, you know, despite all the technical innovations and innovation in the field of medicine, the way the services are delivered is pretty much like it was 60, 70 years ago. Acute hospital setting and physician office, right? Think about the possibility that for a number of conditions are being offered by remote monitoring services, right? Just to give you an example. Think of how this could shape, you know, the relation between patient-doctor and how this could shape also and could enhance the possibilities of the patient to manage his or her own condition, right? And again, this is, you know, pretty much unexplored. I mean, if you look at the numbers in every European country, these are minimal, right? And again, I mean, the last thing is that ultimately, I mean, we might want to, you know, improve supply as much as we want, improve the settings of care as much as we want, but fundamentally, we should, you know, address the demand issue and, you know, build environments which are conducive to healthy behavior, you know, exercise, diet, and so forth, I mean, are critical to promote well-being and wellness, right? And this is the third theme that emerged. Now, the interesting thing is that if you go beyond these commonalities and then you address, you know, the real, you know, fundamental pillars of the visions of a healthcare system, in order to answer the question, is it possible to put things in common and to move towards, you know, a European health system, where you see visions and of politicians, economists, and so forth, I mean, diverging big times. I mean, here I report the Germany and the Netherlands vision, I mean, in a synthetic version, of course. At Davos, we published the full work, and we presented the full work with the World Economic Forum. Well, Germans, I mean, are great. I mean, they basically came up saying a number of fantastic things, like, you know, automotive is a great industry that we have today. In 2040, healthcare will be an engine of growth as automotive is today, right? And actually, we will attract patients from all over the world. We will be setting the standards of care and productivity for, you know, most of procedures. This will be evidence-based due to, you know, lots of powerful data available, and we will be a magnet for talent attraction, right? So the centric German, one of the central elements of the German vision was healthcare as a powerful engine of growth, right, and development, right? This is, you know, right now is an industry which, you know, takes more than 10% between public and private of GDP in Germany. It will grow even more because, you know, we've seen the numbers, and over the last 50 years, healthcare has been always on a growing path. And this has to become a very, you know, engine of economic growth. When you go to the Netherlands and they start questioning, is healthcare going to be a right or a responsibility, right? And they tell you, well, you know what? If we continue on this path, I mean, we cannot guarantee sustainability of our fiscal balances, right, with this growing spend. So we think that certainly we will promote healthy behavior, but ultimately health from a cultural, societal, and political point of view will become more and more an individual responsibility rather than a right, right? I mean, of course, I mean, factoring out a number of public health issues, which of course are part of the picture, but you know, this is a fundamental change in the way we look at our welfare systems, right? As I just said, I mean, the cultural, social, and political differences will basically shape the way we move towards a more let's say, standardized and more common, if possible, health system across the European Union versus a set of different systems, right? And here we listed few of those. And actually, I will not go through all of them, but actually some examples, right? The attitudes on solidarity is the one that I just mentioned, right? I mean, to what degree we want to have a degree of solidarity like the one that we thought about in building our universal health systems, right? I mean, with the growing fiscal imbalances and the growing inequality in a number of European society, this is not to be taken for granted, right? And there are big differences across European countries in this. Influence over lifestyles. I mean, here the issue is, and health culture, I mean, I would put them together. I mean, here the issue is twofold. I mean, to one extent, I mean, of course, education will do its job and will try to promote a healthy lifestyle to reduce the burden of demand. But to what extent education will translate into different habits? I mean, that's a critical question. Right? That's a huge cultural question, right? And so will it be, you know, a personal choice, an aspiration? I mean, the healthy lifestyle will be something like a role model or not? And to what extent will individuals will allow governments to enter into something that sometimes is considered like their private sphere and trying to influence their lifestyles, right? I mean, to what? And actually, you know, should governments try to do this or not, right? Origins of governance. I mean, we've seen in every European country basically that there is a growing decentralization in the way health services are delivered, right? At the same time, I mean, the setting on national standards, of course, is important. But then already in October 2013, there will be a new European directive which allows every citizen to get healthcare in any other country and to be reimbursed to the extent that the procedure for which he or she is treated is included in the benefit package of the country of origin, right? This will be starting as October 2013. So will there be a supranational governance in terms of regulating specialist centers and centers of excellence at European level, right? To what extent we will allow that, right? So the perspective here that then the debate, of course, is open. I think if we, you know, we should think of those as a set of elements that need to find kind of converging and stable equilibrium in order for a European health system to emerge, right? And each of us can claim, you know, yes, we'll go in that direction, we're positive, we're mildly positive, we're negative. I think it's up to each of us. Of course, I mean, we didn't take any position on that point. On a personal basis, if I look at the current divergences in the European countries, I think it's very hard to argue that, you know, there will be an increase in solidarity, that, you know, citizens in different countries will have, you know, a reasonably convergent attitude towards the possibility of governments to influence their lifestyle, that the health culture will be promoted in a way which is kind of broadly accepted and uniform. So I think it's a tough way to go. So hope to have been short. I mean, I summarized the points again. So I simply said we're still not there in terms of sustainability. I mean, there are lots of things to do in terms of sustainability. It is said that the debate is only about waste and improving at the margin the systems, and then there are fundamental issues to be revisited in terms of healthcare systems in order for those to be sustainable. And I also said that the perspectives of a European unified health systems rely on fundamental differences which are social, political, and cultural, and these are, you know, very hard to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. So the system is not sustainable and the reform was very difficult. Now, we ended with the presentation, and we also ended the time. I don't know whether we can open a floor discussion if somebody has to raise some questions, or we can quit here and lunch is going to be ready in 1 minute. Does anybody wish to ask a question about all the topics of the morning? Okay, Samir.
I'll be very brief, but I would like to go back to John Walker's very interesting presentation, because I think during the debate since yesterday, he has raised the issue of where do we stand on austerity, because that's, I think, is at the heart of the discussion we have been having and will have this afternoon. And I think that he glossed very quickly on the fact that the intellectual premises of the austerity school are crumbling. Paul Krugman, in yesterday's New York Times, reviewed 3 books and many others, and provided a very powerful argument that the austerity school was not very well founded. First of all, if we go back to Keynes, he told us that austerity comes in boom years and not in recession years. And that rings very true about what's happening now. It's not because a group of people, the G7 meeting in an exotic resort in Canada, coming and panicking, and then got the whole world panic behind them. The 2 bases that you see, 90%, once you reach the 90% expenditure, government expenditure out of GDP, then this is crisis, is not founded. And the calculations by the economists who did it were erroneous. Secondly, the other foundation that public expenditure should not be used, because some statistical studies have shown that public expenditure has very little impact on growth and employment, which is not true again. So I think here is an issue which we have to revisit very rigorously, and I'm very grateful for John's numbers to have provided very strong basis for that. Thank you.
You, John.
I mean, it's true that I went through that part of my presentation quite quickly because I had a lot of things to cover. I suppose there's 2 points. I think I totally agree with you that many of the academic and other papers used to justify the austerity that's taken place over the last 3 years has crumbled, and probably in a number of cases it would have been wise to have done things differently. But there's 2 points. Firstly, we are where we are. That's happened. Secondly, this is a group of countries that are trying to work together, and whilst I might believe that and you might believe that, there's a large number of people that don't believe that even now. So it's not quite as simple as saying, well, we made a mistake. I mean, it's a bit more than that. But the other big point that I was trying to make is we shouldn't just focus on austerity. There is a large number of other things that explain the differences between what's been going on in different countries over the last few years. We could have done things differently, and I would totally agree with that, and we should have taken much more action in terms of getting rid of leverage in the banks. Some of the other bits of monetary policy we probably made some mistakes on as well. But given where we are now, given that there is some genuine easing on austerity, we shouldn't just think that everything is going to be okay. There are many, many things that need to change. We talked about them in terms of what the European Investment Bank might do, what might happen in terms of healthcare, and I focused on some other things, in terms of dealing with corruption and actually accepting change. I still don't believe, broadly speaking, in Southern Europe, there is an acceptance amongst the population that there should be some changes. There's an acceptance they don't like where they are, but there's a big difference from that in saying, I will accept some change to what goes on in terms of either the way the healthcare system works or the way the public sector system works or whatever. And unless those things are addressed, I do think that there will be not enough progress in terms of improving growth prospects in Southern Europe and in Italy in particular.
Dominique?
Samir, but you say there is, or Krugman says that there is no relationship between government expenditures and growth. Now, in Italy, the share of the government...
No, he was criticizing the studies that say so.
Yeah, criticizing the studies that say so. But when one of the reasons the United States grew faster than Europe in the past was, in fact, that the tax pressure is much less. Now, in Italy, the tax pressure is 47% or more of GDP. The only other large country in which it is more is France, another country that is. So, I mean, I think Krugman is a nasty person, and I told him to his face, a nasty person, because Reinhardt and Rogoff made a mistake. They acknowledge the mistake. You don't have to continue. Allow those people to make a retreat in good order. Do not pursue them. They said, we made a mistake. Okay, now, one could say, you did not make the data available. Yes, they made the data available. So I think Krugman is getting away with murder. Everyone listens to him as if it's another Adelphi, he's wrong on many, many things, and even on this matter. 90%, they made a mistake, a critical mistake. You do not go from growth of 3% to 0 when the debt arrives at 90%. But now, what Reinhardt and Rogoff are saying, but you cannot say that you can continue to increase government debt and expenditures. In Europe we have a recession, but as Paolo Guerrieri said yesterday, the recession is in Southern Europe, not in Northern Europe. They have to spend more. In the United States, we do not have a recession. We do not grow as rapidly as we expected because of structural problems. And you do not solve structural problems with cyclical policies. So, there is more to be said. How far do you want to go and spend? The United States has a national debt of 108% in 2012, as a deficit of over 6% of GDP. And Krugman says you should spend more. Well, how much more? This is not a recession. We have a deficit of 6% and the national debt of 108%. The United States is no longer a virtuous country, period. What would Obama want to do? Spend another from 67% since Obama, the national debt of GDP, now it's 108%. What does he want to grow more by spending more? The multiplier becomes 0. You are just postponing future expenditures to the present and doing nothing. So there is a great deal of, the truth is somewhere in between.
When Paul Krugman was first-year graduate student at MIT, I don't want to feel arrogant, but the same month, I did write 2 theorems in growth theorem that time, and my teacher was Robert Solow. The first theorem says that there are relationships between government expenditure and growth, but this relationship is not linear. In theoretical terms, it depends, but it's not linear. So what I came out with the theorem was some kind of Avelmo theorem backside, that until you reach a certain amount of government expenditure, the effect on growth is positive. After then, the effect is negative. It's not only zero multiplier, it's negative multiplier. So this is the first theorem. The second one is, does income distribution affect growth? And it's the same result. The theorem said that it is not a linear relationship, because obviously if you have few rich people and too many poor people, you never grow. But if you have pure equality, equalitarian distribution, you never grow. So it's not linear, it's a curve. Then 30 years later, this is the theorem, 1976. And you can check, Paul Krugman was first year graduate student at MIT that year. Okay. 30 years later, I did try to measure empirically with respect to European countries, okay? Just to have a figure, because the theoretical theorem is there, it's very clear, but, what are the figures? And I came out 6 years ago, it's been published in London by Parker Macmillan, that over the last 20 years data, on the average of 12 different European countries, the reversing effect between government expenditure and growth, or total tax revenue and growth, for the European countries, 12 European countries, related to the 20 years data, okay, it's around 42%, 41, 42%. It changes a little bit country by country, but it's around 42, 41%. It's very easy to say theoretically, because it's clear that whenever you move 100 euro from the private sector into the government sectors, what you do? If you raise 100 euro taxes, you reduce consumption by 85% and savings by 15%, more or less on the average, maybe 12, okay? The same 100 euro entering the public sector makes usually 97% of consumption, public consumptions, and 3% of savings and investments. So if you take this over 10 years, what have you done in the system? You have just decreased the potential power of growth of the system. That's it. So it's not so difficult to understand. It's a good sense. But what is the problem? The problem is the one was mentioned in Paolo De Santis before. I started maybe 10, 15 years ago to say that within the Italian government expenditure, there was this item, this other item, within which maybe 10, 20% were wasted, robberies, corruptions, and so on. Nothing to do with health, nothing to do with education, nothing to do with the function of government expenditure. And this is the key political point, because it's easy to understand that Italy, with respect to the rest of Europe, is the country in which we are very, very rich of potential resources, much richer than Germany.
And the United States.
Why? Because if we spend every year 50 billion euro on robbery, corruption, and so on, and on the revenue side, we lack 100 billion euro of tax evasion. So what is the European countries that could have available 150 billion euro a year to reshuffle the government expenditure, to remodulate fiscal pressure, and so on? And obviously, the political question is that a small amount of population, politicians, companies, and whatever, are very, very much interested on maintaining that 50 billion of expenditure, the 100 billion lacking in terms of tax evasion, and so on. So the balance is, in this country, 56 billion of normal Italian. Do they weigh more or less than 500,000 Italians that in that specific kind of items of government expenditure have a very, very wealthy situation. So why should they renounce with respect to the other? The position is that until now, the power, the political power of these 500,000 has been higher than the political power of the 56 million. What is the final answer? We don't have, in the next few months, between, I'm referring to Fabio Basagni's presentation, within this coming Christmas, okay, we don't have any alternative but blowing up. So it might be that this kind of reform, I would say, is much better to do that kind of reform the day before. But in any case, we will be constrained to do them the day after. And the day after, as you remember the nice American movie, is not an easy life for everybody, both sides of the balance. That's the key.
One quick thing, because I don't want to be lynched from lunch. Brilliant, Fabio, non c'è bisogno che glielo dico io. But oil, it's true, in the next few years, oil with China, the demand will increase. But China is developing atomic energy on a grand scale, number one, and number two, has huge shale deposits of gas. Second, perhaps even more than the United States. Of course, that takes time to develop, but the markets can anticipate this future online. Also, often it is said, as if it's something negative, that wages in China have increased, or cost of labor, 300%. That's the benefit of growth. In other words, China is losing all of those industries which require unskilled, low labor. This is positive for China. This is how the nations develop. And of course, China should be worried to lose to Vietnam some of the industries that have become industries which are low wage and lower. And to Paolo De Santis also, this thing, I was 40 years ago, I had a professor, Victor Fuchs, who was one of the leaders in health economics. And we say we all spend more. By the way, there is one thing in Italy that you have to stop saying. In Italy, everyone from the President of the Republic to the poor believes that in the United States, before the health reform of Obama, 30 million people, if they were ill and they will go to the hospital, they show, you studied at Columbia, so they are asked, do you have a credit card? Otherwise you get, that is absolutely untrue. This has to stop. In other words, you go to the hospital, they ask you if you have a credit card. If you have a credit card, they put you in a private room. If you do not have a credit card, no one has ever been denied of. But what you said really is very true. Now, we have to pay insurance. Everyone equal. How do we pay automobile insurance? If you have accidents, you are given you have a certain premium. If you have accidents all the time, you pay a higher premium. So now I have to pay for health care for other people. I'm sorry, Mario, I know you smoke. For people who drink 1 bottle of whiskey a day, they are 100 pounds overweight, they smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and I have to pay the same insurance? No, a basic insurance for everyone, but then you have to earn the lower premiums that you have to pay. And we spend more, people want more health care. So if the price was increasing, but if you want more of anything, you pay more. You want more, you have to pay more. Now, if costs increase, if prices increase, that's bad. But you get more real services. At one point, people have to say, how much do you want of health care? And you have to be willing to pay. Well, Fuchs also said one thing. Women used to have longer lifespan and not many types of diseases like heart. Women now want to live like men and they will die like men. You know, but you know, that's so much for health.
Can I ask?
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Just want to briefly comment on this, and then make an observation, which is probably also a question. I mean, commenting on this, a few years ago we did a study. We were looking at the value of the automotive industry in the US, and we were looking at the cost of every single component. The most expensive component in a car produced in the US is the health insurance paid to the worker that contributes to produce the car. So I think the US, personally, I think that it's a point where actually healthcare is, put in a risk. Understand I mentioned the competitiveness of the country. I mean, in my presentation, I addressed the issue of sustainability. We might open a discussion on country competitiveness and to the extent that healthcare contributes to that. I think in the United States, that's a critical discussion. Leveraging on actually the points of Fabio and your point, Professor Baldassarri, I think I wanted to ask a question, and which I didn't hear much. What do you think is going to be adjustment in the Eurozone? I think on the one end, leveraging on Katia, I mean, if I am German and on Fabio, I mean, and I hear that there you have 200 billion, corruption and so forth, why should I take the adjustment, right? That's one thing. On the other hand, I mean, if we look at claims at the European Central Bank level, I mean, we see that Germany has claims of more than 800 billion euros, right? Which is about 9% of Euro GDP, excluding Germany. And the question, under many respects, is will Germany recover part of this credit or will not recover it at all, right? I mean, on the one hand, if I was German, it would be difficult if I was a German worker, having temporary contracts to hear that, you have 200 billion spent, which is corruption, blah, blah, and I should take the adjustment, right? That would be tough. On the other hand, will I recover part of the credits or will I give up all the credits, right?
Don't tell that too much. It's 150 billion, not 200. It's 150.
I mean,
hi.
Okay.
Can I just?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, go.
Because this session is not about China, but I have to say something very wonderful presentation. Because I read the provocative hints, the first one, and the first paradox is related to China. And the key element is the labor costs, which are ridiculous by Western standards. And I completely agree with that. And this is going to change. I agree with the Professor Savaldo's argument. I think rising labor costs is the outcome of a rapid growth, which actually we expect real exchange rate appreciation predicted by the Balassa-Samuelson hypothesis. We really expect that happening, and which is very good for the national wealth, people's living standard. This is going to happen. So this paradox, we have to rethink about it. Thank you.
What I really meant was that you didn't need to have 50% euro appreciation against the renminbi to guarantee your competitiveness. But this is the European stupidity. I would say Chinese smartness and European stupidity to let the euro appreciate up to 140, 150. And if you watch European TV and mainly Italian TV every day, you know how they announce the rate of the change? This way. Today, the euro is much stronger. It's 132. And 1 week after, they say, today the euro is weaker, it's 128. They don't know that the real parity should be 1-to-1 to the US dollar. And the renminbi should appreciate 40% to have a positive sum game in the world economy. This is something I measured 10 years ago, but, cannot be decided. I mean, you have to sit at the table, be into the G8, as China, as India, do the new world governance, and there you have a path toward this kind of equilibrium, because you know better than I, everybody knows better than I. Whenever you put a sticky price into the economy, the adjustment is by quantities. That's what we did. We put a sticky price into the world economy, which is the renminbi pegging the dollar, while the dollar was devaluating, and we had the adjustment in terms of quantities. Huge amounts of quantity moved. goods from China to the Western countries. We pay your goods, we consume, you save, so you save our money that you obtain by selling goods. But you save our money, and then with your saving, you come back here in US or Europe, and you buy us back. This is something that it's unbelievable, and it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for both sides, I mean, not just from the Western point of view.
Yeah, but you need more governance.
Right,
And,
that's the point.
But more governance. China is more than 10% of the world GDP, and 3 times that of England, much more, and has less vote in the IMF than China. I mean, it's unbelievable. China is a smaller vote than the UK, which is a midget in relation to China.
Sure. And Europe should have only 1 seat. Cannot
Otherwise,
have 5 seats.
So governance has to be changed.
You know,
Otherwise,
if you look at the G7, that, you know, as has been said, the nice resort or whatever, but within the G7, the actual G7, what is the role of Canada, Italy, France, Germany? I would say the role of the United States, okay, the role of Japan, okay, but what the other 5? So Europe needs to have 1 seat, then you have China. As the slides I projected yesterday, you know, looking at the actual weight in the world economy, the new G8 is the first G8 economies of the world, which is China, United States, India, Japan, Russia, Brazil. Then you are left with 1 or 2 seats. Yeah. 1 could be for some African country, must be for some African country, and the 8th is the United States of Europe.
Instead, we have the G20, in which all the G7 are there, then Europe on top of it as a unit, and so on. So
yeah, but the danger, but the real danger is the G2.
US and China.
For both of them is the real danger, because it seems to be an equilibrium. You know, while the Americans get debt, China get credit. So if you do the balance sheet, it's an equilibrium. But by accumulating debt on one side and by accumulating credit on the other side. And this is not good for both, creditor and debtors. Because you might have too many dollars in few year times, and the US might have too much debt with respect to China. So what do you do?
Non-sustainable.
So this is something that has to be managed, possibly in advance, but sitting around the table and sharing the responsibility of taking decisions. We need the new institutions, new governance in the world economy. As the same in Europe. We need a new Europe, obviously. USE. Yes. No, I said that us was not US. It was China and the rest of us, not the rest of the USA. Okay, if there are no other questions, we can have... Sure. Sure, Fulcelli.
As a small contribution with the approach of an investment bank, you're talking about public spending. From my standpoint, public spending is an aggregate, which means very little. Has been said yesterday that the Greek crisis started with the public spending for the Olympic Games. Actually, EIB has financed the Olympic Games and the constructions. We don't deem that was a terrible mistake. Okay, the return was not really so sound, but it's not that. The real problem is that the revenues of public civil servants in Greece from 2002 has grown 140% in real terms. In Ireland, 170%, and in Germany, only 37%. So what I want to say is, what is important is to see what public spending. Are we investing or are we consuming? Are we, so going back to what Mario was saying, are we talking about 100% of public spending and only 3% on savings, so investments, or are we doing 50% of, because also the state could invest 50% if we oblige the state to. And then I go to a further point. If we are all linked as we are, should not be compulsory not only to respect a 3% of public spending, 60% of deficit, but also at least a 50% of real investment from public governments should not be a rule not only for saving, but also for how we spend money. Because if Italy doesn't have railways or highways to bring goods to Germany, 33% of BMW is produced in Italy, in my region, in Emilia-Romagna, components.
Yeah.
It costs more if we don't have transportation to Germany.
Yeah. But this is my proposal for Maastricht too. You know, allow governments to do investments and deficit, but with a rule. You have to self-finance your investment at least by 1/3. That's it. So everybody can do whatever he wish. You have a rigorous Maastricht Treaty, but a little less stupid. Much more rigorous in dynamic terms, because you enter with the growth mechanism, and much less stupid than now. Because you can have obviously zero deficit in a country in which, zero deficit in a country in which you have 80% of GDP government expenditure, zero investments, and 80% of tax revenue. So you have zero deficit. Or you can have another country with 40% of government expenditure to GDP, 20% investments, okay, and 40% of tax revenue. Do you believe that these two countries will grow the same path? That's it. That's it. So fundamentals. This is something that Paul Krugman didn't have. He didn't take the course of Bob Solo. I know.
Well, I think it would be a shame to the argument to sort of reduce it to Paul Krugman. I mean, the argument has been with us for a very long time, and if you go back to the notes written by Keynes in criticizing the Bank of England during the recession, is much richer than this. I mean, the arithmetic which the two of you have provided are the crux of the matter. But the point to be made is that an erroneous calculation was taken as the basis for policy making, which is called austerity. And I think Europe would be the gainer, especially for sectors like health and so on, would be the gainer to get out of that mood.
Yeah. Yeah, but the point is, on one side you have Paul Krugman, on the other side you have the Austrian school. So if you put them together, it's a disaster. Okay, we have lunch there, and then we'll start again with the final section on Italian economy at 3.